And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a terrific crowd we have out there tonight already in the ideas room. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And, it's interesting, Olivia, I have to start by talking about the Biden spectacle from the other evening. This was something else to watch him just stand up there, and we went into this moment of freeze, and that's the leader of the, quote, free world. It's getting pretty dicey.
They're taking tremendous risks putting him out there.
Yeah, I mean, they have to kind of show that reinforcement. They do have
I
him.
wouldn't. I'd make any excuse.
They have him on the power Alzheimer's drug. And I read about this through MIT. This was about 3 years ago. And there's something, the original name for it was Storm. But the idea is that it sends all these electrical waves into the brain of somebody who has a kind of dementia, and it allows them to come back And we are back. Wow. Well, how was that? How'd you like that?
That was fun. I'm wide awake now.
All right. Well, that'll restart you. The whole modem had to be restarted and such. It's not even that hot a night out there. I mean, I guess it was warm earlier, but
I don't know what's going on.
All right. So everyone, we are back here with you, and this is X Series 104. And tonight we're going to do something special, which is we're going to look at deep state assassination of female targets. And this is interesting because very often, we hear so much about how they handle the male side of the population. They actually refine what they're doing very often when they're dealing with a female assassination. And there's a number of reasons for that. But there have been some really stunning cases in the past, and it's going to be very instructive for us to take a look at them and see the kind of things that have happened to form a template for these. We've certainly looked at the MKULTRA assassins before, with everything from Mark David Chapman to the Batman shooter. But I think in this case, we're looking at something quite remarkable in the case of Vicki Morgan. And the Vicki Morgan case often brushed over as one of those kind of like, oh, it's a penthouse mistress, who got bumped off because she just was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Actually, the case of Vicki Morgan addressed national security issues and involved some of the biggest deep state players of all, and it was quickly brushed under the rug and became kind of tabloid-ish. As a matter of fact, if you do a deep internet search for Vicki Morgan, you're still only going to find a couple pictures. This was someone who was a model and an actress and went to the Lee Strasberg acting school. And her movie was never released. So
What was her movie?
Well, it's a whole piece. I'm going to get into that,
Okay.
but it is quite fascinating because when we look at somebody with a career like this, there should be a much bigger trail. But the only trail, which is quite cold in many ways, are these kind of sensationalist things about, oh, there was an old billionaire and this kind of young hooker type thing. It's a very, very different story than that. In fact, she's involved with something in deep state circles they call sexpionage, where they find someone who is kind of Mata Hari-ish, who can really go deep, working in intelligence principles. And so once she becomes a regular kind of paramour for, like a Saudi prince or something, she can get a whole bunch of intel. And it works for American politicians, of course, as well. We've seen many cases of this, but it is quite fascinating. And in the case of Vicki, it takes many twists and turns because she came from very humble beginnings, and she went to the very heights of power of her, them using her in deep state circles, and through the figure of Alfred Bloomingdale. And Bloomingdale himself is going to give us a whole new eye on the Reagan administration, of which he was a part. And the Bloomingdales, in fact, launched the Reagans politically in the 1960s. And we're going to see how the scandals that engulfed Bloomingdale actually affected the Reagan administration dramatically and put it in a position of extreme blackmail. And Kissinger and a number of others come into this story. So the more that I got into it, the more I couldn't believe it. But it's a very human story as well, because Vicki turns up as somebody who was, found herself at the age of 17 being manipulated by much, much larger forces, and eventually right in the middle of a national security war on the deep state side. So this is a really deep dive, and the amount of things that have been deleted about Vicki Morgan show me just how important this case is. So we're going to take a deep dive on that tonight. Before we got zapped, I'm going to try this again.
Are you sure you want to try that again?
President Biden did a town hall disaster meeting this week, and he was up there just saying everything backwards. And so it's getting to be a very obvious situation that we're in, barely 6 months into this administration. Quite a disaster in terms of messaging and the strange things that they tried to do. I have to, say I've never seen from the podium there, and they had Jen Psaki up there, saying that this administration was going to be reading your text messages to make sure you weren't texting a friend and saying something wrong in relation to the injection. You know, this, I have to say, is quite remarkable, because that's somebody up there saying, you know, we're working with Facebook to take down posts. Well, that's actually not illegal. Number one, reading your texts isn't either. You would need to go to a judge and get a warrant for that, even under FISA. So if you're going to do it on American citizens, you're going to need something better than some glib Pentagon spokesperson who is now the mouthpiece for the Biden administration, because he can't say anything straight, to come out here and say, Big Brother has arrived, we're going to read your texts. So it's a real crossing of the red line that we're at there with this administration. And I feel that, you know, 6 months is actually a good amount of time to get a feel and let them do what they're going to do. We sort of knew what they were going to do anyway, by the way that they came in. And there was a boatload of fraud attached to that. But nonetheless, in looking at the situation, we can clearly see after 6 months where they're going. They're going domestic terror bill, unlimited spending through the Fed, which will cause massive inflation, and it'll cause also the kind of depreciation of our assets. And they're going to be incorporating all that into this reset stuff under the guise of, hey, we have a medical crisis and you're going to need to do this. So that's the nature of the situation, or as Gurdjieff would say, the terror of the situation. So tonight in the second half of your program, we're going to be taking questions as well. So we'll address some of that when we get in on that. And how's the temperature out there?
It's good. They're saying that your video feed, you sound fine, but your video feed is a little choppy. Is there anything that you can do on your end?
Video feed. Well, you know, the truth is that I think that's pretty much, well, it's in high def here, so it should be coming out high def there.
Okay. Some people say the video's fine, so.
Yeah, you never know. You just you never know. We're lucky. We're actually, you know, lucky to float on the modem tonight, because direct Ethernet connection just isn't happening. But we're not going to get into all that tech stuff. All right. So let's start off with this. I'm thinking that, you know, the way to get into the Vicki Morgan story is to take us back to the point in 1983 of her death. All right, so she died July 7th, 1983. This will take us some 38 years in the past. At the time, it was well known that she was the mistress of Alfred Bloomingdale. And Bloomingdale was the person who was responsible for giving us credit cards. He's the guy with Diners Club and all that stuff in the 50s, because all these rich people didn't want to go packing all that money to these fancy establishments. But the second reason was you could track people and what they were doing. You could track who they were meeting up with, what places they were going, and you could hand that over to an intelligence agency, in this case, the CIA. So Bloomingdale was the heir to the Bloomingdale fortune, and certainly Bloomingdale himself had a number of unusual proclivities, shall we say. It turned out years later that a number of actresses came forward and talked about sexual assaults with him, and he had to, you know, the FBI and stuff had investigated him in the 60s for beating prostitutes, etc. So that by the time he gets to Vicki Morgan, he's showing up and saying, you know, he approaches her because she comes from kind of a small town there in Colorado Springs, and she, with her mom, after her father dies, moves right outside California, right outside of Los Angeles. And they're still in kind of a podunk town. And she gets a job at Grauman's Chinese Theater.
Oh.
And she's really, somebody described her kind of natural charisma as incredibly magnetic. And you can see, I was amazed in going back over the stories. And like I said, there's so few pictures that are actually available of her that you have to go back to books to do it, because she's been pretty much wiped on the internet. But that's Vicki, and she was somebody who had a child back there at 15 years old named Todd. And it's interesting because, you know, so she's a single mom, and what happens is she leaves the child with her mother and she takes off for those Hollywood footlights. So she's there just a little while, and eventually, by the end of that run, she'll be just 30 years old. And
wait, she dies at 30?
All of these things will happen in a very short period of time, some 12 years over the course of time between when she meets Bloomingdale and when she dies. And it's just a little snapshot of her life. And in the course of that time, she gets married twice, not to Bloomingdale. There's an actor in there. Actually, he was the star of Empire of the Ants. We'll get into him too. He was still around. But interestingly enough, Vicki is somebody who gets a lot of modeling jobs, and which is why her larger portfolio of imagery should be out there, and it's not. So there's certainly there's quite a mission out there to kind of remove a lot of the early breadcrumbs that could lead a real investigator back into what was going on with Vicki. But Vicki, we can definitely see as a very trusting person. This is something else that we learn about her as she develops. So what happens is when she meets Bloomingdale, he says, my daughter, she needs somebody to play tennis with. Will you come and play tennis with her? And we should say about Bloomingdale that I announced early on about his reputation there right up front. But this is somebody who had incredible leverage and operated directly out of Beverly Hills. So he has this direct plug-in to that Hollywood scene. And what he does is he kind of lures her into this idea of playing tennis with his daughter before he comes up with his more indecent proposals, shall we say, and starts to offer incredible amounts of money to be his mistress. And basically, she accepts it, and he's paying her $18,000 a month. Back then in the 1970s, if we have to think of this period of time. But something else that he's doing with her, which gets missed even in the really good in-depth articles in the period. And later on, like I said, it just becomes a kind of a tabloid story of a rich guy and a hooker. But in fact, there's something else going on, which is he's having her sign her name to corporations, to dummy corporations, so he can move things around. He's sending her off to Morocco on intelligence runs by having her sleeping with Moroccan royalty and things like this. So it's a very different story than how it's been portrayed. And so her death becomes much more serious and much more unusual. And her targeting and controlling over this period of time and the evidence of MKUltra in her life and in her death and this kind of mental brainwashing control runs deep. Now, it's interesting because Bloomingdale himself and his wife are major movers and shakers there in Washington, D.C., and they're known as the first friends of the Reagans, who become, Reagan gets into the presidency by winning the 1980 election. And it's under very dubious circumstances, but what's going on is that Carter is so demoralized from the Iranian hostage crisis, and they have incredible inflation, like we'll see again, that Reagan kind of comes in on this wave. And Reagan has a kind of an easy manner to him and is a remarkable politician who has run before and almost won in 1976 against Gerald Ford. And Ford plays a part in the Vicki Morgan story as well, as does Bush Sr., so we're going to watch for that. Bloomfield himself has an unusual career because he was going to do the kind of straight-ahead Ivy League school route, and instead he becomes the agent of Frank Sinatra in the 1940s. So he gets himself involved in that Hollywood track, and by the 1940s and 50s, he's managing Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland, and he is really the king of that side of things. And he's doing ads with Danny Kaye and people like that. So he's part of the Hollywood fast track. And what he does by getting into this Diners Club thing is he creates a whole franchise there of credit cards. And credit cards become all the rage as they call him the father of the credit card, in fact. So Bloomingdale has that deep connection, but his government stuff is very under wraps. So he has these deep CIA intelligence connections that are part of his kind of regular routine. And what we see is by the time he gets to meeting Vicki in 1970, that during the 60s, he is there with the Reagans. And it is the friendship of Nancy Reagan and Betsy Bloomingdale, his wife, that makes Ron and Ronnie.
Can you show one of the pictures?
Her hair, yes. That's Betsy there. She has the kind of remarkable hair, and there's a great height differential between the two of them. But she's another one because, you know, their whole thing was, hey, you know, make her ambassador to France. You know, we've done all these things for you. And Reagan tries every which way he can to make them ambassador. But the problem is she has a criminal record. And what does she have a criminal record for?
Shoplifting?
For stealing over $100,000 worth of Dior gowns.
How do you even do that? You can't put them in your pocket.
Well, it's a very interesting story, and I have to say it's odd too because, of course, she's an heiress herself, so this is unusual behavior. So there's a kind of a criminal strain just running through them, but to actually get caught, she had a record, and there was no way they could do anything with her. So they both had a seedy thing, and what's interesting is in the court documents, it came out that although Bloomingdale you know, was doing all these things and having all these orgies and S&M and all this kind of stuff, as we're going to get into later, she also has her own kind of sketchy track record in that regard. Here they are, the top movie producer there, and Reagan, and the Bloomingdales, in fact, financed Reagan heavily, not only as governor in the 60s, but also to become president. In both tries in 76 and 80, they are his top funders. And as a result, Bloomingdale becomes the top man on something that Reagan has, which is called the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. You're going to find some of the biggest people on that board, including Kissinger, Alexander Haig, some of the top brass that we have. And what's happening is before Reagan even gets into office, the person who is grooming his foreign policy personnel is Bloomingdale. This is how important Bloomingdale was to the setup of the Reagan administration. So to find him with these really dicey, you know, activities, as we shall see, gives a whole new look, in a way, at the Reagan administration, what was going on there, and also the depths of the blackmail that were available to the Reagan administration, because it turns out that he was one of these guys like Epstein who was like, sure, come over, we're going to have you do all these wonderful things, we have all these girls set up for you, we're going to have this incredible party, and he had cameras everywhere. Hidden cameras, of course. So his capacity for blackmail was remarkable. Here is, again, the Bloomingdales with the Reagans. That's a little bit earlier. And again, in that social circuit, some of the way that their relationship is explained is a kind of symbiosis where, you know, they needed big donors, the Reagans, and these people really needed the influence because of what they were doing. So what we talk about generally is in terms of blackmail, in terms of the Central Intelligence Agency. When we've come up with the stories about Ghislaine Maxwell or Jeffrey Epstein, and we've seen these and they've circulated, but they still circulate from a very narrow place, in fact. They're still concentrating on a kind of Me Too aspect, which is, oh, Jeffrey Epstein did these things, and they are terrible. But there's a much deeper piece to it, which is, if we go into that history, find Ghislaine's dad, Robert Maxwell, deep in this kind of sex blackmail aspect. So Peter Dale Scott discusses it, and of course talks about J. Edgar Hoover's control files, which is they catch you on video or in photographs, you know, in these compromising situations, and then they use that against you nonstop for the rest of your life. And that's whether you're a celebrity, a politician, a captain of industry, a CEO, whatever it happens to be. So, but how this has developed is not very well understood. So, for example, you know, there's a big piece of this that, like, Bill Gates comes deep into this story, you know. So we're going to be looking at how these things all intersect. Yeah, Gates's dad is deep in here. Yes, what do you got?
No, I just can't wait to hear how he comes in.
Well, we're in for a long evening here tonight, everyone. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 104. And this is Female Targets, the Deep State Assassination of Vicki Morgan. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's going to keep us in touch with this incredible censorship that we've been going through. And this is just the nature of, you know, the environment that we're in at this point. So this conversation that we can have with you, while we're able to have it in this particular fashion on this particular network is great. But just to make sure that it can keep coming your way, make sure you sign up at darkjournalist.com. And that's a free newsletter that keeps us in touch and lets you know the incredible, and I mean remarkable interviews that we have coming up for you. I want to mention that we just got through with an interview series with Catherine Austin Fitts, of course, as a regular on this show. She's been heavily, heavily banned everywhere, and of course, banned even on this channel, or censored, I should say. So I've put out, in the newsletter, I've put out alternate video platforms for where you can find my interviews with her, and also for members we have special ones. But I put together a 17-minute compilation of all the latest interviews, and there's also a new piece of that, which is an hour and a half, which we're going to have coming up as well. So we appreciate that. But I want to say this about Catherine Austin Fitts' work. She's the former HUD secretary, for those of you who don't know, and we've been interviewing here on this program since 2013. I've known Catherine since maybe 2009, somewhere in there, back before I was even doing Dark Journalist. And, I learned a great deal about her approach over the years. But what I want to say about what she's doing now is that she's presenting things that we're going to need, going forward. So she's really getting our attention back on where do you get your energy from, where do you get your water from, where do you get your fresh food from, and these things. And there's a remarkable, sobering quality, in a way, to the work that she's doing now. I highly recommend the most recent clips, the most recent interviews with her. I've attached a link in the description of this video to our latest encounter. And Catherine's doing great work now, and she's in a remarkable situation of censorship. So I want everyone to promote and share her work. Of course, a lot of people are doing that. She's in this network. One of the things she's talking about doing, and she wants everyone to get on board with, is using cash on Friday. So hashtag Cash Friday. And this is something that I think is a fantastic idea, because something that Catherine Albrecht told me, who was the remarkable expert on technology, and who in 2007 wrote a book called Spy Chips, which basically outlines exactly everything that has happened to us over the past decade in terms of tracking and NSA hacking and all this kind of stuff. Things that, a decade ago you would have been looked at and said, oh, what are you, crazy? And people did. They said that to us. Well, we don't feel good for having been right. And I bet somebody like Catherine Albrecht really doesn't, because she was so far ahead on this. But one of the things that she said was, cash, use it or lose it. So as they incorporate these kind of digital systems for things, they're moving towards the central bank digital currency, which Fitts calls the central bank digital control system. So this idea of Cash Fridays reminds us to be using cash, and it sends a message, a ripple across, which is that money is circulating on Friday. And that's a Catherine policy that I think we can all implement, regardless of how heavily censored she is at this time. Her message getting out, I think, is absolutely crucial. And so we can all learn a great deal from her work and her latest Solari reports. We do have some remarkable interviews coming up for August. So roundabout way of saying, make sure you're on that newsletter list. Okay, getting back into it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How did this show is a little unusual for you. How did it come about?
Well,
do you even remember?
I was literally looking at the Mary, there's a few. The Mary Myers story, of course, has always fascinated me. And I did a show like 3 years ago about deep state witness elimination, and how I think they're really up to this. And whenever I've looked, either it was holistic doctors or bankers or whatever it was, and when they were deleting people, they were deleting their knowledge base. And I realized this is what they've been trying to do online by making sure no one talks to anyone. They had the Australian health minister out there, and she has this wonderful accent. It's too bad she has to use that accent to say such horrible things. And she was up there and she was like, however much your human inclination to speaking with one another is, you must stop it. You must resist speaking to one another. And I was like, she's really just gone crazy, right? The Prime Minister of New Zealand, she, it's like Eva Braun up there now. So these people are being, kind of zombified into this new reality for them. And so they've just being programmed to spit this stuff out and hoping that people
or rewarded.
Yeah, it's a health dictatorship, what they're working towards. They'll use something else, by the way. This is really ideal for them right now. But just like during 9/11, they use that to do certain things with planes, for example. Oh, you need to show more identification. Oh, we need to scan you, all these types of things. So they use terrorism, as we've demonstrated, they use UFOs. This is something they're building up for the future. And on the UFO side, I want to say that they built up this thing as a test run, as you noticed earlier this year. They were slamming it hard, and then boom, it went out. Right after the news report went down, the UFO reporting, they weren't talking about it. I thought, this is strange, because they're really pushing it hard. And then all of a sudden, all this stuff about masks and all this stuff came up again. They're balancing off against each other. They're trying to see, can we get more traction doing this? Have people burnt out on this? No, go back to that Delta variant thing. This is what we're going to do. One of the great things that happened when I was researching the background on how they set this up was that the term social distancing actually came out of Bush documents. That's Bush, W. Bush. And they had gone through this whole idea of, can we have people wear masks, and they were thinking about it in terms of like an anthrax scare, and they shelved it. They said, well, people will never go for this. In 2006, that's what they thought. By 2020, it was a different story. So somehow in the realm of the deep state targeting, I started to notice that the women in targets of the deep state were dealt with differently, and that they would use them to a certain degree, get all that they could out of them, and then they would have the same type of thing, like the designated scapegoat, the person, there's a patsy in this story too, who had nothing to do with the crime, which is very obvious, and who also is very deeply attached to the William Morris Agency. There's a whole Hollywood connection in here, so we're going to get to that as well. But I guess really the short answer to what you're saying is, that female targets aspect, I think, has been a little misunderstood or not covered enough. So there is definitely a different type of MKUltra programming that they use when it comes to women, and certainly Vicki was deep in the heart of that. So let's take a look at the crime through the eyes of a really good ex-FBI investigator. And I have to say that when we get into some of the different interpretations of how things happened with Vicki, when you read the straight ahead thing, well, she had a roommate, Marvin. He was sort of he was broke and she was mean to him, so he killed her. Just the most ridiculous story you've ever heard in your life. And the crime scene and everything else just breaks down dramatically when you look at it, even a half-inch deep. So something else entirely was going on there, including the fact that the witnesses at the murder scene had seen 4 people coming out of her apartment. That's a lot different than one guy. The other thing is that her 14-year-old son was supposed to have been there. So, you would imagine if somebody was getting murdered with a baseball bat, that if your 14-year-old son would get up and call the police or something. The behavior of the patsy is also interesting, because he waits 3 hours and then he goes and tells the police, oh, I murdered Vicki Morgan. And that's Marvin Pancoast. We're going to get into him. But they said, well, what did you do in between? After you did the crime, what did you do? Were you trying to cover things up? He said, no, I went down to McDonald's.
Did he say it like that? Was he sort of zombified?
Oh, there's a whole thing about how when he showed up there, he didn't speak for 45 minutes.
You mean he just stood there?
He sort of said, I'm here because I committed this murder, and then they would ask him questions, and he was completely zoned out. Wow. Let's take a quick look at this. This is William Turner as the ex-FBI agent. He's done remarkable work on these deep state style cases, and this goes all the way back to 1984, but we're going to pick out a few key points. The article is called Who Killed Vicki Morgan? And so he says, this is the question that may bring down the Reagan government. It didn't. While the question of the murder still hangs, an eerie silence descends on the media. Scraps of yellowing tabloid front page photos of the gorgeous model and her multimillionaire patron whipped through the cold winter streets of Ronald Reagan's America. The truth of the murder and cover-up is now beginning to bleed through the boilerplate of sex and scandal in Hollywood. The red footprints of murder lead right past the bludgeoned corpse of Vicki Morgan and into the official corridors of world power. In the end, Vicki Morgan was a bit player in death, as she was in life. She, Vicki, a young woman with an extraordinary potential, was made into a victim of power, because that is what Morgan is all about. Power. The name Vicki Morgan has been tossed by the media into a dirty cubbyhole filled with old press clips of Mandy Rice Davis, Judith Campbell Exner. Judith Exner, by the way, was the woman who was the girlfriend of Sam Giancana, who Frank Sinatra had hooked up with JFK. And so they were getting information in the mafia about the presidency through Exner. And so he goes on to talk about this whole piece, like this kind of Marilyn-ish type thing. So a few key points. Fledgling actress Vicki Morgan was used to being approached, but the older man who followed her into the Old World restaurant on Los Angeles' Sunset Strip seemed different from the rest. It was not only that he was distinguished looking and well tailored, but there was a quality about him that was both theatrical and powerful. This is something that they say about Bloomingdale's a real, Vicki describes him in court documents as incredible Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. So he could be the sweetest guy in the world, as evidenced by the fact that he did in fact try to leave her all this money, which his wife zapped, and that really caused this whole palimony case. But what's interesting is that his dark side of, the S&M and the really kind of hardcore domination, torture, and all this type of stuff, the sex slaves, it shows what's very strange is the people who met him would have these kind of glowing things about him, like, oh, he's a great guy, he's remarkable. The 17-year-old Vicki had no idea who Alfred Bloomingdale was. She had never traveled far from the lotus land of Southern California, so made no connection with the Bloomingdale's department store in New York, a family enterprise that was the wellspring of his wealth. She didn't carry a Diners Club credit card, so had no idea that he was the Diners Club founder. And she didn't read the society pages of the Los Angeles Times diligently enough to realize that Al and his socialite wife, Betsy, were mentioned with monotonous frequency, often paired with Governor Reagan and his wife, Nancy. But she gave Mr. Bloomingdale her number. This is interesting also because Alfred Bloomingdale's partner in Diners Club was a man named Frank Abramoff. Does that last name ring a bell? Thank Jack Abramoff. Jack Abramoff is how we really get most of our lobbyist laws now, because he's the one who broke them all.
Wow. And
he broke them for the Bush administration. But before that, he had been a 20-year-old Reagan supporter, and he actually formed here in Boston an incredible Reagan youth group that spread across the country and helped with the 1980 election. So he, all the way back there, was a major mover or shaker. And in everything from gambling casinos to his mafia connections, we're going to see Jack Abramoff really show up dramatically. But his dad was Bloomingdale's partner. So keep that in mind. There's also an interesting Cosmos Club connection with the Abramoffs. So if you've been watching the show on the Cosmos Club, this is going to be a real eye-opener. I want to finish this little piece, and then we'll move on. Even though dead, Bloomingdale died of cancer in August 1982. This is really what set everything off. Bloomingdale left a videotape legacy that ticks like a time bomb, its perimeter of destruction reaching even to the White House. For among the performers on these filmed tapes are members of the president's inner circle in positions not always missionary. By the time of his death, Alfred was genuinely in love with Vicki and determined to provide her with life insurance. She was a girl who knew too much, who would be terribly vulnerable when he was gone. This is, again, a little piece of that weird stuff, and I have a picture of them together. There's only one picture of them together, but it is, you can see that as twisted as Bloomingdale was, he had some genuine attachment to her, because he had her not only working for him, in these capacities of getting sexpionage from these foreign dignitaries, but he also, for 12 years, provided for her every move. He controlled her every move, but he had that deep attachment. That's a little more Vicki for us, who had really achieved that kind of lifestyle of the rich and famous.
I gotta say, she's incredibly alluring. There's something magnetic about her.
It is interesting, and she's a victim of abuse. We know that, and she has a kind of a natural magnetism. And it's interesting because when you think about her, it's almost like she understands, or they're attracted to her in that world because they are, by nature abusers. But she really, I think, was tagged in a way that is almost supernatural when you think about it. We like to think about these things in very direct terms. But in studying the cases around female targets, I've almost found that a lot of them have had very kind of supernatural aspects to how they're get involved in the first place. And it seems like even from an early age, these things happen. That is more Vicki in that kind of fur coat luxury elegance. Most of the pictures that I've found have to do with various books. Like I said, her pictures have been very heavily edited off the internet. There she is, and she's reading a book because she wanted to be an artist. That is Picasso's Picasso. And over here we have the juxtaposition of the Bloomingdales getting married there, and the strange early kind of 1940s version where he's in Hollywood, making it big with all of this money that he has and starting the Diners Club. Another kind of key figure who comes in here and blows the situation up after Vicki's death is Larry Flynt of Hustler magazine. And he had a tendency to get himself involved deeply in those political situations. And he's remarkable in this sense, which is here he is running, this kind of low brow version of Playboy. And he is doing some of the most incredible political reporting. If you go back there, it's like he's blowing open so much about the deep state. And Larry himself, of course, the attempted assassination on him, which left him incapacitated in a wheelchair for most of his life after that. I think it happened in 1979. I have that right. But he went on, and he actually died this past February. And interestingly enough, the thing about the tapes, the videotapes of these officials, which were supposed to be in the possession of the lawyers of Vicki Morgan, and these officials at these sex parties, well, the presence of those tapes and the story of those tapes becomes remarkable, because what happens is Flynt moves in immediately to get those tapes upon the death of Vicki Morgan. So we're going to get into that, and why, when he passed away in February, there was a threat out there that these tapes were going to be released, in fact, because he was supposedly the man who was in possession of them at the end. We'll see about that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are getting into X-Series 104. We had a zap in the opening, but now we've gone deep into the Vicki Morgan story. And Vicki Morgan is not just your casual murder case. And this is not just a mistress, and a millionaire with something to hide. This is an entire system operating side by side with the regular world that we understand. And we interact with it all the time, whether it's Netflix, all the Hollywood stuff, the daily show about, the daily reality show that is the presidency now, and the politics that we have. There are these intersecting forces. And what we can do, even all the way back to the Kennedy assassination, when we brought these things forward, there is a dark journalism aspect to this, which is if we can understand and unravel the disinformation of something, for example, the Kennedy assassination was 58 years ago, we have the ability, because all the information is out. Things that have just happened, this thing that's going on now with the whole COVID piece, it's very hard to get a handle on it, because when these things happen, it's very difficult to see where the forces are. When you're looking back and threading it, you can actually find and identify those forces, and then you can extrapolate out to find out who is doing what. So, you know, when you get researchers who are well honed on studying assassinations, it's very easy for you to look forward and see the future of how this kind of New World Order piece is being rolled out. And so in the case of Vicki Morgan, it's going to give us a real understanding of the political situation and this thing that's been operating, which is very hard to identify. It is, in fact, often invisible. So when we're talking about the deep state, again, at times we get flashes of the deep state because people who are deeply, deeply associated with it have been in the public eye, like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. The people who are associated with the continuity of government program, they're deep staters. But that entire network that operates there is very secret. So even though we know about the World Economic Foundation or Schwab or Bill Gates, it is the structure behind them. We can see through them to this structure if we can get our lens adjusted correctly, which is what we're trying to do in a story like Vicki Morgan's. So we've demonstrated that the Bloomingdales had this incredible power over the Reagans. And Betsy Bloomingdale, in fact, was said to be such a confidant of Nancy Reagan, and Nancy Reagan made so many of the decisions of what Reagan himself should be up to. You know, here's an interesting piece as well, which is Nancy Reagan was very drawn to astrology and used astrologers to map out Ronald Reagan's schedule after the assassination attempt, especially because she didn't want him to be assassinated under any circumstances. And so she worked closely, and that got revealed over time that, in fact, since the 1950s, they had been working with psychics. They had been working with astrologers in order to guide his career. And they never made that public, but they were very happy to do it, and it was very important for them to do, in fact. One of the things that I saw was that...
Diana in the background.
Yes, that's them at the... it's Lady Di and Charles's wedding, in fact. Oh. So yeah, they, and it's interesting because when Alfred Bloomingdale comes back from that trip, he has throat cancer. Mm. But I think that, you know, we're getting a light there on who is really putting these things forward. So when we look at Reagan, you know, we have somebody who's coming out in the 1950s and 60s. By the way, Reagan had UFO sightings, and there's a famous incident from 1964 where he rushes into a party with Nancy and says, "We've just been chasing a UFO for 45 minutes in our car." Lucille Ball remembers that. You can't get a better witness than that. So, you know, Reagan's very tuned in on this stuff. And it feels like there's a kind of naivete with Reagan, which is heavily, you know, Nancy is more of the mover and the shaker, and Ron is kind of the front man. Think of it that way. But Nancy now, she works closely with Betsy, and Betsy is like, here's the things that you need to be working on. She's kind of like inserting ideas in Nancy's mind, and she's the one who gets them into the governorship with Alfred's money. So this is a kind of a key piece, because when we look at the figures around Reagan who will be pulling the strings in the future, Bloomingdale is not often cited. He's overlooked dramatically, when in fact he's a key man in the background of Reagan's governorship 2 terms and presidency 2 terms. Yeah.
Are there any rumors about Betsy and Nancy in any kind of a lesbian relationship?
No, you know, there's lots of rumors about Betsy and her sketchy
like
past.
what?
Well, we're going to get into Betsy more. But, you know, I think it is interesting because when you try to catch up on the Reagan side, all around him there's orgies. Mm. You know, there's
this is so different from how history portrays them as the ultimate squares, right?
Exactly right. Well, you know, they had the huge patriotic image, and there's no doubt that, like, you know, when you look at the bushes and stuff, the sleaze is easier to see in that case. But I think that there is something. I mean, the Reagans came out of Hollywood, and they were both in that Hollywood machine. You have to remember that. So, you know, we're starting to get a feel now for who was behind them. So, and then we have the fact that Bloomingdale is there in Beverly Hills, remember, and he's managing major acts. Think of Sinatra. It's pure mafia and pure CIA. So that's where so much of this story is going. Who's in the middle of all that? Who's running Las Vegas in those periods? It's Howard Hughes. So there's this track here that we can get a picture of, and there's going to be some new figures through Tracy that we get a look at in this. But one of the things I wanted to mention is while Nancy is using astrology over here to help Reagan, we also have an incredible fascination with astrology on the part of Vicki Morgan. And she will only select lawyers who have some understanding or some practice of astrology. So this is somebody who dabbles in these esoteric things, and she's also known to have dabbled in more deeply occult stuff. And we're going to find there's a big occult thread with the Bloomingdales as we go forward. So let's move now and just wrap up this piece with Turner. So Turner was the ex-FBI agent who, when he was writing about this in '84, the stuff that he was saying, people were really riveted. You know, they were like, "Oh, you know, get that off. Let's get it into this story of this kind of dirty old man who was trying to keep this thing from his wife," type story, and then she ends up dead. And by the way, she ends up dead because she has this roommate who just happens to be, you know, a psychopath. And 3 weeks after living there, he kills her. Well, in fact, he had known her for 5 years, and he worked at the William Morris Agency. And he, in fact, was very, very close in setting up the actors and actresses and producers and directors. And by the way, other people who William Morris Agency promotes, including political figures like General Alexander Haig, and the Reagans themselves, when they are shopping for a book deal after they're out of office, it's William Morris who handles the shopping. So it's bigger than just a Hollywood deal. It's the Hollywood political crossover. But we're going to get into him, Marvin Pancoast, here. And he is somebody who worked at William Morris, and he had an incredible database that he stole. And he was the one who was working on this. I'll set you up with this massage. I'll set you up with this escort. You know, this was his role. He was like a big internal pimp there at William Morris. So, and what's also interesting is they try to portray him as always desperate for money, and he had a lot of stress in his life. The people who knew him were like, "Oh, we know his mother. She's incredibly rich. He's a trust fund kid." So all the typical stories that are there back there for us to look at and trivialize in a kind of 80s, was it the Hallmark movies around then, or was it something else? All that stuff is there as an overlay. But if you go even, as I said, a half inch deeper on it, the whole thing disappears. And the only thing that he's good for is, since he had some psychological issues and was under hypnosis by his psychiatrist, this is the man who was eventually tried and found guilty for killing Tracy Morgan, Vicki Morgan, Tracy Morgan. He was under an experimental hypnosis, and in fact, by the time his trial hits, his entire confession is scrapped that he gave to the police under those weird circumstances. And his lawyers based it all on the fact that he was hypnotized to go to the police station and to confess to this killing, when in fact he had nothing to do with it. All right, so directly from the Turner article on this. Vicki, cut off from a lifetime allowance by a vengeful Betsy Bloomingdale, filed a palimony suit in the course of which she gave a kiss-and-tell deposition that raised even the lawyer's eyebrows. Coupled with the graphic evidence of the tapes in her possession, she might have talked herself to death. She became obsessed with the idea that Nancy Reagan was going to have her killed. I thought that was interesting, considering, remember, she knows and is close with who? Alfred Bloomingdale. and his wife is best friends with Nancy. So why was she thinking Nancy's going to kill me? I mean, it gives you kind of a Hillary feel. Less than a year later, July 7th, 1983, Vicki was found bludgeoned to death in her Studio City condo. The police arrested an out-of-the-closet gay named Marvin Pancoast, who shared the quarters with her, and Pancoast promptly confessed, but he's since recanted the confession. Remember, this is still, the case is still unfolding in this period, but has since recanted the confession, and there is precious little evidence to implicate him. In fact, Pancoast was a longtime friend of Vicki with no discernible motive. He had no criminal record. There was a distinct possibility that Vicki was murdered by a person unknown because she was privy to the carnal orgies of powerful men. The killer might have been looking for the sex tapes. In fact, the apartment was ransacked. Also, she was killed with a baseball bat, and there was no blood splattering on her dress. So that is also a big puzzle. There's no finger.
Meaning, like, they changed her? Like,
well, it could be that, or it could be that it's such a precise assassin. Instead of some random act of somebody killing somebody with a baseball bat, which would be very messy, they knew how to do this to make it look like that, and then just... and the police, in fact, mishandled all the evidence in the case, and it becomes one of those strange cases like the RFK assassination, where all the evidence ends up in this weird trail, and the police just say, oh, yeah, we really blew it, sorry. And one of the things that they did, in fact, the murder weapon itself was never tied to Pancoast in any way. In fact, it belonged to her 14-year-old son, and supposedly it was randomly picked up by Pancoast, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll just read a little bit more of this. There is a distinct possibility she was murdered by a person unknown because she was privy to these orgies. Right. So Pancoast lacked the motive, but there are others with a motive. The Rebel, which is Larry Flynt's magazine here, where this article is taking place, has interviewed a friend of Pancoast whose information strongly supports both the existence of the tapes and suppression of the Bloomingdale Morgan story at the very highest level of the federal government. The witness, who insists on anonymity, was an employee of the big William Morris talent agency in Los Angeles during the time that Marvin Pancoast worked in the copy room there. Now, I want to tell you that this witness's testimony was so suppressed, and they tried to get rid of the Rebel magazine, and did as a result of this episode coming out. Now, here's the interesting thing also about it. There's a producer back there named Alan Carr, who did movies like Xanadu and all this, Can't Stop the Music, I guess is what he did. So like big disco musicals, and he's, like Mr. Fabulous, this kind of guy. And he remembered things about Pancoast, which jibe very well with what this person is saying. And he also remembers that Pancoast had taken their entire database. So he was doing this networking thing, which you do see later in these circles. Okay. So this whistleblower who's talking to Turner off the record works at William Morris. And Turner is an ex-FBI agent. He knows how to trust his sources, how to, kind of sift through the wheat from the chaff. The witness states that Pancoast saw 2 or 3 of the films, which he described as very explicit, okay? Pancoast lived in such a narrow world that he could not have recognized any political figure. Vicki clued him in because she showed him these tapes. Those are Reagan's friends, Vicki said. The witness further advised that Pancoast, who wanted to help Vicki tell her story and raise some money by publishing a prospective book titled Alfred's Mistress, arranged a meeting for her with Morris's agent, Steve Weiss, who, with the okay of his boss, Larry Orbach, began negotiations to represent Vicki in the sale of the book rights. This is just before she died. Vicki visited the agency 3 times. So advanced was the deal, around July or August 1982. Remember, she's dead by July 1983. Norman Brokaw, a senior Morris agent who represents General Alexander Haig, who is a lifelong deep stater, psychopath all the way back to the JFK assassination, and was there during Watergate, and also was the Secretary of State under Reagan. So that's who Morris is representing here. And this guy also represents ex-President Gerald Ford, among other famous names. He receives a phone call from Ford. If Vicki Morgan is signed up by your agency, Ford threatened, the IRS will come down on you immediately, and that comes right from the White House. According to two sources at the William Morris Agency, President Ford was at least a social acquaintance of Vicki Morgan and Bloomingdale. The sources, who insist on anonymity because they fear for their jobs, describe parties at Palm Springs that one source characterized as the whole Sinatra, Agnew, Annenberg set. So this is the whole interface of entertainment with politics. So basically these kind of group orgies, these scenes, all these different things. But they all knew that Ford knew her because, of course, Ford has a very deep history in regard to this, as we found out in the Kathy O'Brien story. And it's going to get even deeper. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series episode 104, and we're going deep here on the death of Vicki Morgan, who was assassinated by the deep state for what she had, and also the kind of messiness of Bloomingdale being associated with her that had come out after his death, and the strange Palamona case where she submitted all this evidence, and then the courts are stuck with all this, and the story ripples out, and it could take down the entire Reagan administration. This is 1983. This is the third year in, and things are just starting to turn around in the economy. Reagan's looking forward to 1984. They're looking to say, you know, it's morning in America. We're going to be reelected, and things are going to, George Bush, you know, who tried to get in there on Reagan's assassination, didn't quite do it, but he's also looking forward, and he's saying, you know, Reagan can't last forever. You know, Reagan was showing signs of being slightly, you know, we know he developed Alzheimer's a little later.
He was starting to falter.
I think after the assassination attempt, which happened only 3 months into his presidency, I think it damaged him a lot. And I think Bush got a much bigger seat at the table. Reagan did get to accomplish some of the key things he wanted to do, cutting taxes, standing up to the Soviets, reducing the nuclear arsenal. But the CIA was able to get the Contra Wars and all these types of things. So I want to remind everyone, before we go any further, go to the Dark Journalist website, darkjournalist.com, and sign up for a newsletter. Make sure you're on that newsletter list for things that we have coming up. This is a crucial period of time where we're seeing that incredible wipeout of truthful voices online. And in particular, as this is coming up, we need to kind of hunker down and support each other more than ever, because we're seeing this incredible blowback. And, you know, it's interesting when you try to censor that much, people do get the idea after a while that you have something to hide. So that's what we're seeing on these networks across the board. But nonetheless, we're very pleased to be with you here tonight. All right. So what happens, and the kind of upshot of all this, is that Bloomingdale, by having this position where he's appointing Reagan's foreign policy cabinet, and where he's working that closely with him, when it gets out through his death that, you know, his mistress has these tapes and has all this information, then she becomes an instant target. Now, she never went out publicly and said, I have tapes of these officials doing it. It came in relation to the fact that Betsy Bloomingdale had cut off the money that was coming to her, that a contract had been set up and negotiated a year earlier by Bloomingdale, who knew that he was going to die, and he wanted to make sure that she would be all right. Now, interestingly enough, there's a little piece here, which some of you may remember, Pizzagate, this very strange little thing that trolled out on the internet and got mixed in with the Q stuff online. It was all about Podesta and the WikiLeaks, and the whole reason that Assange went to jail in many ways is because these types of things can never be allowed to come out. Now, the story got overblown, and there was a disinformation layer on top of it. You know, when we talk about dark journalist and dark journalism, we talk about three layers there. There's the official story, And then there is the secondary story, which, blows holes in the official story. And then there is the third level, and that is the junk conspiracy. The junk conspiracy is forever meant to make people go back to the official story. So, the Kennedy assassination is a great example in that sense. The official story, oh, hey, Oswald just happened to, out of nowhere, get a job 6 weeks before the president went by this window, went up there with a gun that didn't work and got 3 shots and a magic bullet, and it killed Kennedy. And that he was a big left-winger and all these kinds of things, when in fact he'd worked for all these right-wing groups in New Orleans. So that's the official story, completely ridiculous, including the magic bullet, which, they say follow the science. Well, science would say you can't have magic when it comes to bullets. So the secondary story, which are called conspiracy theories, are that the CIA, who had, after all, been moving Oswald around like a dot on a board, was involved in setting up Oswald for the crime because they had organized a very, couldn't miss assassination, which is what they were very good at. And there was a long thread of research around this that showed that the CIA was involved in the killing. So that's the secondary story. That's the kind of dark journalism. Then underneath that are junk conspiracies, oh, the driver shot him, things like this. Oh, he's still alive, that kind of stuff. So that's just junk conspiracy to make you say, oh, I can't figure it out. I'm going to go back to that dumb official story. At least it's halfway sane. And that's the way that junk conspiracy really operates to create the situation that we're in. So, we have to kind of look at a lot of these things that take place through this lens. And in the Vicki Morgan story, the whole thing about Pancoast being this broke roommate is a big piece of that. All right, so we're going to wrap up Turner's article here. So Bloomingdale had a seat on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, as well as one on the President's Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. This guy was deep. And that helps to tidy up after messy intelligence operations. So he was there, Bloomingdale was there as a kind of a cleanup man. So you had people like William Casey, who was known for his pretty wild antics with CIA. He goes in, he has the Contras like blow up a church in Nicaragua and it kills clergy. This is CIA tactics, for takeover. They'll just do what they need to do. So what they have Bloomingdale acting as is kind of a cleanup man on that group. Now, what's interesting is that it is in fact Nancy Reagan who views Vicki with Alfred Bloomingdale. She's the one who sees them together and tips off Betsy Bloomingdale. And that's how so much of this happens, where they cut off her allowance and everything else. And that starts problems. And then he dies, tries to leave her money, and Betsy Bloomingdale is not having it. So she goes to court, and she has a real high-powered lawyer who's done this kind of stuff and this kind of work named Marvin Mitchelson. And together they ask for $11 million from the Bloomingdales. And that's when all of this information and all this stuff gets out. Once she's dead, they can kind of bottle up the case, which is really exactly what happens. And this is how this has become kind of a forgotten piece. But we'll wrap up on this with his article. So Ronald Reagan was almost certainly aware of the Alfred-Vicki relationship, since Nancy had found out about it even before Betsy. After Vicki gave Alfred her phone number at the Old World restaurant, he called the next day and the next. For 2 months, he called no less than 5 times a day and up to 20, so he was completely obsessed with her. Vicki kept protesting that she was married since he wasn't talking about tennis. This is how they first met. But she finally agreed to meet him for lunch at the Old World. For appearance's sake, Alfred brought along another woman. Alfred wanted to see her again. She yielded, sensing that he might have a beneficial influence on her fortunes. The rendezvous was at Schwab's drugstore in Hollywood. And this is interesting, too, because Schwab's has that reputation of being a place where these types of setups have occurred. But in fact, what happens in the long run is that he gets her into running these kind of slave rings where he puts her in charge of these prostitutes who act out a number of different scenarios for him.
Are you going to go into this?
Well, we're going to see how much we can get into it. But what is fascinating about it all is the devious nature of what the kind of person that he is, and that kind of mind control aspect that he's engaging her with, you know, that they need to call him a king and stuff, and that he needs to whip them. So
he's whipping them.
Yes, yes, that's true. Yeah, he's not a masochist in that sense. So now let's look at Pancoast. I think this is going to dovetail in the right way. And Miss Olivia, if you have something, you can
I was
go
a little
for it.
confused. So Vicky's in charge of the other prostitutes?
That's the role that he gave her. So
Does he not beat her? Is she?
No, she
singled out?
gets beaten as well.
too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The whole thing is this is a shot of them together. In fact, it's the only shot of them together, and it's interesting because that's at the end of his life. But you get that this has gone on for 12 years, and he's used her in all these intelligence circles, and he's also had this kind of, you know, ongoing obsession with her, almost to his own peril as well, because he's put his own, you know, everything he's achieved in getting Reagan into the White House, he's put it all at stake, and he's risked everything. But one of the things that he's also done is he's used her, and when people looked into it after his death based on her documents, they started to see, oh, this whole thing when we were talking about Pizzagate, well, there was a company called Showbiz Pizza. And Showbiz Pizza was a large chain that he had put a lot of money into, along with these other backers, and that Vicki owned with him a 10% share in. So those are in documents, we know it for a fact. Showbiz Pizza is strange because of this Pizzagate thing that came up later. And I want to describe what Pizzagate is here for a moment. In those WikiLeaks documents, what came out was John Podesta talking to a number of people on the campaign staff of Hillary Clinton and using these terms about pizza and a map of pizza and things that didn't make sense if you were talking about it. On this show, we talk about steganography quite a bit. So pizza is something which, you know, to people would just be like, this guy is looking, he's talking about pizza places. But there's this weird obsession about a map of pizza places. And then there's a number of different terms of how you like your pizza and all the rest of it. So the terminology is bizarre. And then what happened is the next layer that came on top of it is they try to tie it into an actual place, the Comet ping pong and all that stuff. So all these things happened, and then the Q stuff ran it through the dryer about 500 times. So by the time it came out, it was all miscombobulated and everything else. However, the fact is those emails were very strange. And the initial piece of the Pizzagate part sounds a lot like the Franklin controversy, which happened during the Reagan-Bush era about all of these officials being involved in child trafficking. So those things were on the record. There were cases, there was testimony, and in fact, one of the biggest fundraisers for Bush went to jail for 20 years over that whole case. So there's a lot in that thread. It seems to me Bloomfield running these kind of Epstein-style operations, orgies, blackmail, and all of the beating shenanigans and all the S&M and stuff, you know, knowing that his big venture there were these showbiz pizza companies, as soon as that case went to court, Betsy Bloomingdale pulled all the money out of Showbiz Pizza. So
wow,
I think it says a lot that this idea of using pizza places, there are a number of pizza scandals, in fact, from the 80s and 90s, which have to do with mafia and drug running. So the idea of human trafficking is a piece of that, and then that finally coming out through those WikiLeaks documents, which, remember, are secret emails that were hacked between Podesta just, you know, sending out emails to his friends, gives us, I think it does give us a real link, because we're looking at the real foundation here of what was going on. So this is Pancoast, and I think it's important to note that he didn't previously have a criminal record, and he certainly was not known as somebody who was violent. So there's no history of that. And as far as, he met Vicki in a rehab, and she got along with him fine. And, you know, Vicki was a survivor, so, you know, if anything, people kind of leached off of her. But the idea that her radar was so bad that she moved in with, you know, this guy who was gay, who could potentially have killed her, doesn't add up. And the story is that, you know, his motive was that she treated him bad, like an errand boy. So by treating him like an errand boy, he wants to kill her. All of a sudden, by the way, they've been friends for 5 years. So,
Right, how about just leaving? How about walking out of the apartment?
I'm very glad that you mentioned leaving on that, because what happens, in fact, when we go into the story, is that we find out that she was moving the next day. She had called the movers, and in fact, when they were giving her quotes on certain rates, Pancoast got on the phone and said, there's another place over here that does it even at a better rate. So he was in on the move and all this other stuff. So it had already been decided that she was moving out and that he had temporarily stayed with her, and they were both leaving. So it was not, you know, the way it's been presented in terms of the types of desperation of, you know, this guy living there and being broke doesn't make any sense. He had a trust fund. She was moving. They had never had signs of having fights. So, you know, there's the official explanation is complete bunk. Now, in terms of what actually happened, if you go back, there is the Dominic Dunn article from 1985 from Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair in those days would do pretty good examinations. There's still too much of the overhang of this, you know, powerful billionaire and hooker idea, high-priced hooker. But if you go a little bit deep in there, he starts talking about this aspect of it, which is the witnesses, in fact, in the building had seen 4 people come out of the apartment late. The other thing is that there is that gap where he supposedly killed her at midnight and then shows up at 3 a.m. in the police station. That's pretty hard for a confession. And then his explanation that he went to McDonald's, I guess it was an all-night McDonald's. You know, so these things, none of that adds up, and it has all the earmarks that the deep state loves of the designated patsy. You know, and this is the kind of Oswald patsy story. In this case, I think the only thing that they needed here for this story to work is that he had some kind of psychological background. His doctor, in fact, had said, yes, I've been using an experimental hypnosis on him. And, you know, I suppose with his kind of persecution complex, he could have done this, you know. But the idea of hypnosis in relation to this case makes a lot of sense by his actions, by the fact that the tapes of his confession disappeared from the LA police. That's pretty unusual.
LA is classic for this.
It's amazing.
Sam 3 says, didn't they meet in rehab?
Yes, they did. Mm-hmm. They originally met in rehab. And she had just gotten off of a whirlwind thing of going first to Morocco, where apparently Bloomingdale had sent her to get information on this official there, and she had this.
What does
affair.
That mean?
He sent her on kind of like a, you know, a sexpionage type thing. And the details are tough, but she had opened up and talked to various people. Because one of the things that was also happening at this period is that she was looking to do a book, and the book was going to, just before she died, the book was going to just balance out the story. It's like, this was what they did to me. She, in fact, avoided, you know, she had been invited to do these various things once the case got out. And she avoided it. She avoided anything to do with the scandal and didn't come out to, say, look, this is my story, like a Jennifer Flowers type thing. She avoided the spotlight on it, but she was working with someone, and the piece with him is also rather interesting. So I think that he was writing the book, and it was supposed to be an autobiography, and he was ghostwriting it. So I looked into this guy a little bit. He had written some stories for The Streets of San Francisco, which was a television show in that period. And he had said that a producer friend of his had hooked her up together. One of the things that Dominic Dunn pointed out about him is that he was seeing her. So they were having an affair while the book was being written, and also that he'd gotten painfully little of the book done, even though they'd worked together for 6 months. So there's something that was odd there, but I think it was tremendous pressure. He was also considered a suspect in the beginning because they had this close relationship going on, and he was there all the time. So, he happened to be married also. So his wife was his alibi. She said he was home watching TV, and that was that. So, there wasn't a lot that they worked on there. But his presence in the story, I think, is unusual. And then eventually he would write this kind of Bad Girl Vicki book. But he does, to his credit, give us some of the hints of how Vicki was being used by the Bloomfields. He does not, which I find very strange, go deep into the deep state aspects of her death. He knows that Pancoast didn't do it, but I found his output very uneven. Everyone in this case, it's like there's no clear road. It's like the deep state was in such trouble with this case that they had to rely on the media to cover the entire thing up. So to recap here, so we've got Vicki Morgan, who is a model and an actress, who at the age of 17 meets Bloomingdale. Bloomingdale, one of the first things he does is hand her $8,000, saying, oh, I need a partner for my daughter playing tennis, which was a total ruse. And then she becomes his mistress, et cetera, et cetera. But she gets away from him during these periods. And as I said, she married an actor at one point. It was a short-lived thing. And she married a real estate guy. And then he went, Bloomingdale, to the real estate guy and said, how much money will it take for you to divorce her? So, there was this weird thing going on in this whole period. One of the people that it turned out that she met and then she went out with, she has a long list of Hollywood credits, but there were only a few things that I found particularly interesting. And one of them is this guy named Bernard Cornfeld. Cornfeld is just a strange character in a lot of ways, because he comes out of this kind of Brooklyn setup and he goes to the Netherlands and he creates the mutual fund. And he sells this very unusual mutual fund instrument to American servicemen. Well, this thing goes through the roof and American servicemen are buying this all up. But by 1971, it's exposed as a scam. And in Europe, he is facing this really deep case that goes on for 7 years. And it's a huge fraud case, and the company itself starts to dissolve, in fact. One of the interesting things that happens is the company at the time, it's Governor Brown from California, who becomes one of the chief CFOs for the company. So it's a really strange cast of characters around this thing. But what he does is he shows up during this period where the case is going on for 7 years. He shows up in Beverly Hills. And he becomes Mr. I'm funding this movie, I'm throwing this lavish party, and he becomes Mr. Beverly Hills Hollywood. And he's right there in the midst of all that. And if you go there, you will see him partying and being best friends with Warren Beatty on one hand. His other best friend, Michelle Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. So very deep operator, this guy. Eventually gets into natural foods. But
what was the company that he started? It's that pyramid company?
Yes. Well, you would know that. It's
Something Life.
Yeah, well,
Herbalife,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And well, what's interesting is that later period, the 90s period of his life, is sort of like recovery after he spent all the millions and billions. But his presence in the 70s and 80s in Hollywood, I find absolutely fascinating. So what gets to me is that he then, being with Vicki, they're a huge piece, they're a huge item, and Bloomingdale is supposedly out of the loop. But in fact, what it looks like to me is that she's gathering information with Cornfeld, and eventually she's going to, again, get that back to this network that Bloomingdale is deep on that intelligence side, so that by the time she gets out of that relationship, she has all this incredible knowledge about these things. The other thing that's strange is that Cornfeld himself sets up a sexpionage unit. So he creates...
this is a good idea.
He has his own thing, and in a way, he does it better than Bloomingdale.
How so?
I think because he has better connections. But so we're looking, and I think he's also maybe less twisted, not much less twisted, but somewhat less twisted. And we're going to find some strange things out here when we get into it. So what have we got? We've got Larry Flynt from Hustler magazine being kind of heroic, exposing this case. We've got Bloomingdale, who's the father of the credit card, and he is the foundation of Ronald Reagan's political aspirations. They are the first friends, and Nancy is best friends with his wife. We've got Vicki Morgan in the middle of it all as a high-priced mistress, but also a kind of a sexpionage blackmail agent. And we have all these interesting intersections of the William Morris agency in her death. So we're looking at a real interesting aspect of the deep state. I remember when Professor Peter Dale Scott told me where he got the term for the deep state. He was observing a case in Turkey where a car crash had happened. And what happened was, in the car was a leading politician, the chief of police, a huge gang member who was like a drug runner, and a beauty queen. And they all were in the same car and they died. So it suggested this weird collaboration between, these beauty contests, drug running, politics, and these gangs and the local officials. So this aspect of the deep state, this is what we're looking at again when we're seeing this, but it's not visible unless we can see how it interacts with all these various pieces. When we get those dots connected, that's when you get a picture. It's not just a punchline, the deep state. This is something where you can really get your hands on it and say, aha, these people moved in on the political side. They were interacting with this major piece on the Hollywood side. That got this law enforcement side involved. That brought in the blackmail. So those are the types of things, organized crime, the CIA, the contracting agencies who handle intelligence, the groups that manage wealth on that higher level, and then getting into things like the oil companies and the piece, and then finding it there as a focal point right in Beverly Hills. So we're, when we get into this case, we're going into a deep dive and getting a real snapshot of that. But then they're faced with a problem when Bloomingdale dies and Vicki is suing his estate because all these things may tumble out. So then let's go into the post-Vicki's death period, and how to stamp this out and get rid of it, and the people who stood up trying to get something of this out. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew! I'm telling you, when I was looking at this case, I spent days and nights just deep in the details. And the amount of things that have been taken offline about this case are absolutely mind-boggling. And it shows that there's a cover-up that operates even to this day involving the Vicki Morgan story, unless you just toe the official line about, you know, this high-priced hooker who got murdered. Now, we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program, which is coming up pretty soon. So I better move on the Larry Flynt piece. How are you doing out there?
I want to ask you a question.
Yes.
So, Isa Peacekeeper wants to know, that baseball bat was supposed to be her son's. Is there any information about where her son was during the murder?
This is the weird thing. It is very strange. The son was supposed to have been there in the apartment. So this is why the death, the fact that, you know, he wouldn't notice his mother was being beaten with a baseball bat at midnight doesn't really add up. The son was young. He was 14 at the time. His name is Todd. He still lives in Southern California. And oddly enough, what happened was after Vicki's death, a lot of strange things started to take place. For example, Bloomingdale's estate decided, you know what? We'll leave her $200,000 now that she's dead. No problem. So he certainly inherited that. But check this out. It goes deeper still. Suddenly, someone out of nowhere, a good Samaritan, decides Vicki's funeral service, put it on my tab anonymously. No problem. Interesting. So there's something operating after she's dead where it's like, let's just clear the accounts and get out of this. So, and there's a lot of unusual activity, but at this kind of interesting point after her death, her lawyer, who's also a very, very interesting guy, he says that a woman comes up to him during the funeral service. And the funeral service is held at this place called Forest Lawn. And Forest Lawn is where Ronald Reagan got married. So that's just an odd, kind of interesting piece. But so this woman who looks, she's blonde and she has a kerchief on and sunglasses. She looks like she may be a model. Some people said it looked a lot like Vicki herself. Goes up to the lawyer and hands him a suitcase and says, everything that Vicki wanted you to have is in the suitcase. And he goes back to his law office, looks at the tape, and it's all Reagan officials. According to Larry Flynt, Edwin Meese is the official who was up for being Attorney General at the time. And he becomes Attorney General. But the lawyer's watching these tapes and he's seeing Vicki, Bloomingdale's, and all these Reagan officials. And he gets freaked out. He goes and he gives a press conference and he says, I have these tapes. I'm not trying to make them public, but I want to say that I think they have national security implications. I've contacted the Reagan administration about this. I want this taken off my hands. And what happens is Larry Flynt jumps in there and he says, I'll give you $1 million for those tapes. Just give me the tapes, no questions asked. And they make plans to meet. Now, there's two different stories about this. One of the stories is that Flynt meets him and he gets the tapes. But what actually happens is the next day, this lawyer, who I'm going to go into here, he says, oh, you know what? Somebody broke into my office and stole the tapes. So I don't have them anymore. So there's nothing I can do about that. And no, I never met with Flynt. And I never talked to him. Now, Flynt talked to him for sure because there are witnesses. There are people who say that Flynt met with him. So this is where things get very confusing. And Flynt himself, Flynt has been deep on this political side, working against the deep state. He was the guy who in the 70s put up $1 million bounty for anyone giving him evidence about the JFK assassination to blow the case open. Later, he would do this on the Trump side, trying to get money for dirt on Donald Trump. So he's not, he's not somebody who chooses sides. He goes after them all. And one of the things that I found interesting when looking at Flynt is that Flynt was incredibly effective politically, and that he was driving a lot of the political debate points. And since he was doing it, everyone else could pick up on it and say, hey, we got this out of Hustler magazine. So they had to put an end to that. That's where I think he got shot. But he continued on. And he decided, you know what? I'm going to give some of the most hardcore people like Turner, the ex-FBI agent, and people like Mae Brussell their own sounding board, and I'm going to create Rebel Magazine. And so Rebel Magazine was where they could really dish on these things. Now, what happens is that he asks Mae Brussell, who was a big conspiracy theorist who had been funded by John Lennon when she started, and she was an incredible, remarkable, we've touched on her work before here a few times, but she was somebody who was very ahead of her time. And, she talked all about the Bilderberg stuff. This is way before Alex Jones. And she's more on the left side of it, which, the left was very different in the 60s and 70s. But she was an absolute ace on the assassinations and the deep state. So she understood everything about the JFK assassination. And she understood a lot about the Nazification that came about in the government post-World War II. So many of the things that we talk about with Dr. Farrell on this program, he's very aware and has benefited greatly from the work that she laid down. She's pretty much the only person who laid down a number of those things in relation to the CIA, having such a huge Nazi influence with General Galen and so on. So what's interesting is Brussels does an article and for this Rebel magazine, and he's like, you should really take over Rebel magazine, drive it, you can be the editor, do the whole thing. And he said, I'm writing an article about the Tracy Morgan, about the Vicki Morgan murder. And what happens is there's a character in the middle of all this named Gordon Novell, who was a CIA operative. And Novell has such a scattered history in the 60s, but he's always around either atomic projects or around the UFO file. And what happens is he shows up in New Orleans in 1967 as somebody who can help Jim Garrison with all of the CIA bugs and things that they're finding, because their phones are being tapped by the FBI and the CIA. So he's an electronics expert. This is his cover. And so this Gordon Novell goes to DA Jim Garrison and says, I can help you with all this. And what Garrison discovers, and later tells Brussels, is this guy bugged me worse than any CIA person could. So they had sent him in there as this kind of, Trojan horse. Novell has a very weird, scattered history, and he had worked for the intelligence agencies. And what happens is he moves in with Larry Flynt. So Larry Flynt, is living with his wife and stuff, but he, this guy gets so into Larry Flynt's head about how I can help you unravel these different things, that here you have this big CIA operative in the middle of all this. So he's driving Flynt into a kind of a frenzy. And so at a certain point, Flynt calls Mae Brussels and he says, I have the tapes. I have the Vicki Morgan sex tapes. And I'm going to put them out there, but when I put them out there, I'm going to be killed. So, what I need you to do is I need you to basically be a witness so that people will know how this happened and everything. But he's also starting to talk crazy. And so she's known him for years, for 10 years. And so it seems very strange to her. And so she says, maybe, if you're so frantic about it, don't do it. And then he calls her back and he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to announce it while driving through Dealey Plaza. And it'll bring all the attention, and the government will be completely shut down by this whole thing. So the Kennedy thing will get exposed because we'll have all of these things out. So he's talking very crazy like this. And what happens is that Novell gets him involved in this whole DeLorean case, and that's a whole other matter. But he gets wrapped up in that, and there are federal charges on him for eavesdropping and all the rest. And so his life kind of goes into a spiral for a long time. And Brussels said she thought he was never the same again. So that's where a big piece of the whole Vicki Morgan tapes thing goes. But what I want to do is step back and get into Vicki's lawyer, who was the guy who originally said, I don't know what happened here. Because it's a weird story, if you couldn't imagine. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in X Series 104, going deep on the deep state story of the assassination of Vicki Morgan. And we're going to be taking your questions here shortly, but how are you doing out there?
First of all, is Morgan Vicki's real last name?
Yes.
Okay. David Termina is asking, DJ, seems like there's something about the name Morgan. There's the legends of the Morgan from old Irish mythology. Do you think Vicki could be connected to this ancient Morgan faction?
Wow, that's really fascinating. I can tell you that one of the reasons I came up with this deep state female targets is I've found a series of targets with the deep state that seem to have something extra going on. It's not just their political position. It's not their value to the deep state from a political point or, just a sexpionage, blackmail angle. There's something else that they seem able to either recognize or to be able to identify. And it gets very unusual. It gets into this piece that you're discussing, which is that it's almost as if there's some network that becomes aware of the presence of this person and then seeks to manipulate that for their own benefit. So what you're saying here about the name is very interesting to me, I would say. And that would be one of the avenues that I would pursue in trying to figure out why she becomes such a target for them. In looking at others who are in this same kind of strata, where it seems like there's something extra going on, it actually feels like these people are identifiable. And I go back to what Steiner had said in relation to Helena Blavatsky, which was that Blavatsky, the different schools were aware of, the secret societies were aware of, based on astrology. So they knew that she was going to be there. She was going to show up at a certain point. So there seems to be some mechanism in place where they are aware of these people and what they're going to do. It's almost like a destiny line. You could look at it that way. And, it brings me back to a Casey reading where they're saying, there's all these rumors right now that there are predictions embedded in the pyramid. Are they? And Casey says, certainly there are. And they say, well, how can you read them? And he says, well, there's all kinds of different ways to read them, but they're left in mathematics and the type of stone used and all these different categories he mentions. And then they say, well, how precise are the predictions? And he says, they're precise down to dates, events, names of people, and the streets, their address. We're talking about a very precise computer readout there in the Great Pyramid. This is extraordinary, and it's always, that's the kind of thing that makes me stop when I think about these things, because it becomes almost like there is a destiny piece. So certainly the mystery schools from the left-hand side being aware of this, just like the right-hand schools are, have the ability to be able to pick out and identify certain types of individuals. There's no question about it. So the name certainly is a good place to start. Yes.
Flying memorials. The biggest irony for me as to why Ms. Morgan's history has been scrubbed so much, combined with the Reagan administration connection, was President Reagan having his one film as a villain taken from all shelves?
That's true. He has one film where he's a mafia boss. And it's a remake of The Killers with Burt Lancaster. And he does slap around one of his gangster malls in it. And it's one of the last movies he made, too, post-Bonzo movies. He's actually pretty good in some movies. He gets a bad rap, because he's
fine as a sidekick.
He has a very, very excellent presence, I feel. Reagan was always, if you go back and watch his speeches, he has great timing, and he's exceptional at communicating. They called him a great communicator, and it was that acting background that really brought it home. But, he was an announcer before he got into acting. So it was the voice that was the lead piece, I think, with him. And, when you think back to it, people they remember the look, but the voice is just overwhelming and quite interesting, I would say. He has a mixed background because, Reagan was a lifeguard. So I think underneath, he saw himself as kind of a white knight. I don't think that he was coming. I think that the political establishment corrupts you, and regardless of where you're coming from. But certainly between Hollywood and the political world, he was somebody who was prone to being manipulated in a number of ways.
Fuber Fighter says, he used to be the great communicator. Now we have Biden. Perfectly stated. We have to live in a surreal world where we have a media that says, oh, you can't criticize him because, he's not Trump and Trump is bad, and you're bad if you say anything bad about Biden because Biden is good and Stephen Colbert likes him. I was telling you about the weird Stephen Colbert thing. They have this guy as a weird attack dog, for anything that Jen Psaki is putting out. And, whatever she says has to be backed up by a comedian. It's getting weird, isn't it? Remember when comedians were just doing comedy and they could tackle politics, but they didn't beat you over the head about what you needed to believe? It's quite fascinating when we get into it. Now, attorney Robert Steinberg. He's Vicki's lawyer. For a while, he's Pancoast's lawyer, but he gets these tapes handed to him in a suitcase. He goes and watches the tapes, and it's all these Reagan officials doing really, he said it was a threat to national security. So, meaning, if you sift through a lawyer's language, that whoever is in the videotapes can be blackmailed by a foreign power and made to do things that would be debilitating to the United States. So this is where this whole thing was coming from with him. And Steinberg, though, is odd. One, he shares his practice with Vincent Bugliosi. Bugliosi, of course, from the Charles Manson case, but later as the chief JFK debunker with reams and reams of books and the big, gigantic book about there was no JFK assassination. So a real deep state operator and a weird history himself, including being in cases where he's representing, this woman against her violent husband, and then he starts to become violently obsessed with her, and all these weird stories come out about Bugliosi, showing him to be incredibly unstable. And but Bugliosi has this, he's the deep state operator. He's the one that they put in the middle of these cases. And so the fact that Steinberg is sharing, if it's their firm together, is disturbing. There's also the fact that Samuel S. Brody, who is who Steinberg took over for. And I'm just going to say briefly that he was Jane Mansfield's lawyer, and they were together there at the Church of Satan with Anton LaVey and all that. And he's there, and in fact, in the car accident when Jane Mansfield dies. So there's a very weird twist whenever we get around this case where things like this fall in all the time. So Steinberg instantly,
there's a lot of pieces here. I collected a lot to show us about Steinberg, so let's get into that now. Let me start with a couple of these things. One is, right now, if you or I go to ask the LA police for information or any records on the case, as this individual did. So July 22nd is from a year ago. So this happened a year ago. The guy says, "My name is Ricardo, and I'm working on a TV show for the digital platform Refinery 29 that will air on QB. I'm interested in obtaining the following information in regards to the murder of Vicki Morgan, who was killed July 7, 1983 in Los Angeles, California. Marvin Pancoast confessed and was convicted of the crime and sentenced to 26 to life in prison. In fact, he would die shortly after that, getting AIDS in prison. Pancoast confessed, I am requesting any and all interrogation tapes, audio recordings, if any, crime scene photographs, booking photographs for Mr. Pancoast, and police reports that are associated to this case. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you." That's the request. This is the response by the police. "Dear Ricardo Ramos, I have reviewed your request for copies of the Los Angeles Police Department's crime and incident reports and/or related evidence. In accordance with California Government Code, Section 6254, records of investigations conducted by, investigatory files compiled by, or any local police agency for law enforcement purposes are exempt from disclosure, aka we don't need to show you anything. To the extent that records were located, they are either investigatory records themselves or property and part of an investigative file. Therefore, I am denying your request. The records could be provided pursuant to a subpoena or court order related to pending litigation. So you have a case where you need them, well, then we'll consider it. You'll have a subpoena. All right. They'd probably tell you no then anyway. Should any records be located, if you are the victim's legal representative, you may contact Los Angeles Police Department's Records and Identification Division." And he blows them off. LAPD Discovery Section, Police Department. That's it. So you can't get any records on Vicki Morgan from the police, and you can't get anything about Pancoast and his confession. So it's starting to look like that whole thing was set up from the beginning, and that Pancoast was the weird patsy that they selected, and that somehow his involvement with William Morris made him identifiable, that they had kind of profiled this guy. Well, this would be good if this thing comes up. Remember, Morris is the same agency that was planning to publish her book that Ford then threatened the IRS will take you to town if you do this. So we have former President Ford there trying to protect current President Reagan. This is where this is going, and they're all doing it through this Morris agency thing. Here's another interesting piece, which I haven't even brought up yet, which is that Vicki herself says that when George Bush Sr., as VP, came to Los Angeles to give a speech, she was the one who gave him the tour. She didn't say that she was his escort or anything, but she said Bloomingdale had said, hey, you have to give this guy the limo tour going around. And so whatever it was that she set him up with, so there she is interacting with the vice president. So, this is the nature of the level that she's dealing on. We have to remember also that Bush Sr. was a CIA director in 76, so that he, if she's working in Sexpionage, they're very well acquainted. Couple of quick things here. I wanted to show you some backup for what I was talking about earlier about Showbiz Pizza. The victory for the Bloomingdales was not complete, however. This is from the LA Times. The summary judgment did not extend to the written contract between Bloomingdale and Morgan, in which he promised her $10,000 a month for 2 years and half of his interest in the Showbiz Pizza Place restaurants. So that Showbiz Pizza deal was something that's on the record, and it comes directly out of the court documents. So we don't have to guess about if that was actually true or not. I also think that some of the actual headlines here would be good to kind of parting shot. This is, and that one's directly from the Montreal Gazette. Died almost exactly 1 year after she filed a $10 million lawsuit. It was actually 11 in Superior Court against Bloomingdale, saying she had been his mistress, therapist, and confidant for 12 years. Therapist. Bloomingdale died in August of '82. Most of Morgan's suit eventually was dismissed. Police Lieutenant Dan Cook said Marvin Pancoast was booked for investigation of murder Thursday after he walked into the North Hollywood division and said he wanted to talk to homicide detectives. Lieutenant Cook said that after the conference, police went to the 3-bedroom North Hollywood condominium that Morgan shared with Pancoast and found her body sprawled in the bed, a baseball bat nearby. She'd been struck multiple times with a baseball bat in the head, Lieutenant Cook said. Pancoast told investigators he and Morgan had a fight. That was it. And then they say both were unemployed. Remember, she's moving into a new apartment. She has plenty of money from Bloomingdale. He has a trust fund. So the cover story, they were struggling and they got into a fight about money. Doesn't add up at all. An autopsy found that Morgan died of multiple blunt force injuries to the head and skull fractures. L.A. County Coroner spokesman Bill Gold said. Lieutenant Cook said Pancoast and Morgan had known each other since 1979. They began living together about 3 weeks ago, but planned to move to separate homes Thursday, the next day. Morgan was 17 and Bloomingdale in his 50s when they met in the 70s. Her suit said that he paid her as much as $18,000 a month and that she gave up modeling after he promised to support her for life. Bloomingdale was former head of the Diners Club, heir to his family's Bloomingdale department store fortune, and a member of President Reagan's kitchen cabinet of advisors. The kitchen cabinet was interesting because before Reagan gets in, it's so obvious that he's going to win that he has a series. It's a cabinet, but he's not president yet, so they call it the kitchen cabinet. And you have some of the biggest, heaviest movers and shakers in there, and Bloomingdale is right in the center. Last February, the state Supreme Court upheld the dismissal of Morgan's $10 million request, $5 million for breach of an oral contract, and $5 million from Bloomingdale's widow for allegedly interfering with the contract. Okay, so Steinberg, the attorney, after Vicki dies, gets these tapes. He comes forward and he says, I have all these things. Then the tapes disappear and he says, I never talked to our friend from Hustler, Larry Flynt. But then later charges are brought against Steinberg saying you filed a false police report by saying you had these tapes, which is like, we're going to punish you now. But then something else happens in the case. Lawyer quits Morgan case after seeing sex party tapes. Someone else sees them. So it's more than Steinberg now. Remember, the FBI guy, Turner, had gone and talked to Pancoast's friends who said, oh yeah, other people have seen these tapes. Let's look at this real quickly. A lawyer who represented the confessed killer of Vicki Morgan, longtime mistress to presidential confidant Alfred Bloomingdale, withdrew from the case yesterday because of a dispute over videotapes. He said showed top government officials and sex parties. So the original statement by Steinberg was there are things of high risk to national security of the country they wanted to bring out in case that we didn't care, in the case that we didn't care to bring out, Steinberg said. There are elected officials in the government who are videotaped. It's very embarrassing. It's the kind of thing this country doesn't need right now. Vincent Bugliosi, Steinberg's partner and the former Los Angeles deputy district attorney who prosecuted the Charles Manson case, said he had discussed the tapes with Steinberg, but had not seen them. Can you imagine these tapes, right? Here's a guy who's had some of the biggest cases on record ever, the Manson case, one of the biggest ever. So his partner says, I have these tapes. And Bugliosi says, oh, that's good to know. I don't want to see them, though. What's going on there? At the White House, Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speake said, without specific, there's no way I can comment or pass judgment. Lawyer Arthur Behrens will represent Pancoast and said the suspect in Morgan's murder will plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Yesterday's scheduled court arraignment for Pancoast was continued. So what happens is other people go on the record saying, I've seen those tapes. And then we have the weird thing with Flynt. So obviously, the tapes became a very a flashpoint, but it also sent shockwaves because people started to think, oh, there are tapes. I am being taped. Now, what Flynt does in 1985 is he writes an article after acting all crazy and all that. And he says, okay, here's the deal. I know for a fact that Henry Kissinger got his hands on those tapes and has been blackmailing the Reagan administration ever since. So according to him...
That is so easy to believe.
According to him, it was Kissinger who was the one who finally got his hands on the tapes and used it to blackmail the Reagan administration. You know, there's a lot there with Kissinger, who once said to a prime minister of Canada, you know, the prime minister had said, well, we want to talk to President Carter about something. And Kissinger said, Carter, the president doesn't make any decisions. You have to talk to me. So this thing about Kissinger using those tapes to blackmail Reagan is really fascinating. Reagan's officials being involved in this, Reagan being easy enough to manipulate so that they get into this situation is also kind of interesting, because remember, they used Reagan to get in 1980 and to crush Carter, which he did. And when he wins re-election, it's the biggest victory in history. But the truth is they try to bump him off 3 months into office and replace him with Bush back then in 1981. And it's strange, if you go back and you look at the records of that period, it's like a season of assassination. You have John Lennon's assassination, December 8th, by an MKUltra suspect carrying the Catcher in the Rye. By the way, the guy who shot Reagan, who is free now, he has his own YouTube channel, John Hinckley. He does music on it. He's out. He's free. I wouldn't suggest him asking. I wouldn't suggest asking him about shooting Reagan. That'll trigger off the MKUltra. But what's interesting to me about that entire case, first of all, he had a documented association with the Bush family, and in fact had plans to meet a Bush for dinner like 2 nights later after attempting to shoot Reagan. So this is a really weird thing, and you can go through NBC reports, Time magazine, those reports at the time, although they don't mention it anymore. It's documented proof that Hinckley and the Bushes were close, because Hinckley's dad was big in oil and Republican politics, and Hinckley had been part of the World Church Services, which was this kind of weird set up thing that his dad was deeply involved in, which sent these people all over the world. And, you know, the other person who was involved with that, and it was operated through the YMCA, was Mark David Chapman, who had shot Lennon. So both of these guys had been all over the world. And maybe in Hinckley's case, you could understand it because his parents had money. But in the case of Mark David Chapman, he had almost nothing. He had like $120 in his bank account when they grabbed him. So, you know, there are pieces here when we get into it and when we're looking at it. So they certainly had the idea of, we'll put Reagan in and then we'll just get rid of him. You know, this is where they were coming from. But then he survived. So we have to think about that. In this period also, just previous, Anwar Sadat got shot and killed in Egypt. He was the president of Egypt. And then the Pope assassination, 1981, is that attempted assassination doesn't work, just like the one against Reagan doesn't work, barely. So there's a whole wave of it's like assassinations back in season. You know, you had the Kennedy assassinations, MLK, and everything through the 60s, and everyone thinks, oh, there was something that happened in the 60s. Look at the period 1980 to the end of 1981. It's like bop, 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 bop. So somebody was using the old script there, and they did get rid of Lenin. And, you know, Lenin was somebody who they had an old score to settle against in any case. But what I wanted to say about Hinckley is that he also had the Catcher in the Rye at his place when they found that. And they found him with notebook, you know, annotations on Catchers in the Rye. And, you know, when they bring Mark David Chapman into the trial for shooting John Lennon, what does he have? He starts reading the Catcher in the Rye. I mean, you know, when the police pick him up, he's reading the Catcher in the Rye. So this is his MKUltra fix. You know, this is what will keep him in his role there. And of course, every year, you know, that he's up for parole, and Yoko Ono goes there and says, deny him. And they'll never let him out, but they did let Hinckley out, which I thought was remarkable. Yes.
This is, the chat is incredible tonight with information. So Richard Warner wants to know, please ask DJ his view on Bush Sr. being involved in the attempted assassination of POTUS Reagan.
Well,
it's pretty clear, isn't it?
Here's the thing. Anyone who studies Bush knows that he was involved with the Central Intelligence Agency during the Bay of Pigs peace. He was in Texas. He was close friends with George de Mohrenschildt. In fact, there's a letter that surfaced between them where de Mohrenschildt was saying, I'm being, because of my association with Oswald. De Mohrenschildt is a millionaire oil geologist, and he befriends Lee Harvey Oswald before all the bad things happened to Oswald. And he's close friends with George Bush. So there's a direct relationship with the early assassination piece and Bush. Then late, and his father, Prescott Bush, his bank was raided in 1940 for trading with the enemy. All right. So they're already, you know, the trading with the enemy piece, and, you know, the person he was working with was Allen Dulles. Okay. So it gives you that whole CIA setup, those people. Union Bank was the name of the bank. And supposedly, I asked Jim Marrs about this once, the late Jim Marrs, great interviews. And he said, I said, why didn't they prosecute Prescott Bush? I never understood that. And he said, well, you know, the thing was they were going into World War II, and they would have prosecuted him basically in 41, 42, when we were just getting into World War II. And he was the head of the USO. So it would have been incredibly demoralizing. Instead, he got off with a warning. But, you know, Prescott Bush and the Bush family, people have studied it and put it on the record for years. But there's no question that Bush, you know, being the head of the CIA, how often do you get a president of this country? It's never happened that we get somebody who was the head of the CIA as president. That's about as low as you can go. And it was interesting because, you know, I was watching an interview with Putin, and he was the head of the KGB. So he is kind of a good example of this. But he was talking about the JFK assassination, and he said, you know, he's talking with Megyn Kelly, and this is like from a year or two ago, and he says, you know, let's face it, you know, it's obvious that the special services assassinated President Kennedy. Many people in your own country say so. He knows all about special services, having been in charge of the KGB. And so the special services aspect, you know, he has no illusions about it. So when they look at us, they can easily see, oh yeah, your CIA killed the president. We get it. So when you're talking about it with Bush, you have to say, you know, the CIA believes in assassination, and they believe in succeeding and moving through assassination in a number of different countries. That's what they did. Either they overthrow the person by creating a false revolution, or they just bump them off. So, or they take them down in a scandal. You know, it's funny, I was mentioning this period where we get into in 1980, 81, all these assassinations are happening. Lenin, the Pope, President Reagan. But if you go into the period where Kennedy was assassinated, here's what's going on there. The entire government of the UK had been taken down in the Profumo affair, which was a big sex scandal. So all those leaders were gone. In Italy, they had taken down the leader. The head of the UN went down in a plane crash. The DM brothers in Vietnam were assassinated a month before JFK was assassinated. They were running they were running South Vietnam. So, we're looking, there are periods where there's like a frenzy to replace all these people. And when we look at our own period now, when we see people like I was talking about earlier, the New Zealand Prime Minister, we see Boris Johnson acting very, very bizarre, very strange, like as if they Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? This guy just became a complete dictator overnight. And so when we're looking at this, we see that there are times when there are pressures for these people to do things, and they, it's like what Professor Scott calls deep events. They'll reach into the public sphere. They need to do something. They'll do it, and then they kind of retract and go back. We're left with all the rubble of what's happened, just like 9/11. So we need to be able to identify those types of patterns when we see them in government, and they are incredibly well displayed in these periods of time. Certainly in that period 61 to 63, there's all kinds of Lumumba is another one. So in the 80s, we're looking at that period. When you go further out and you're looking at this period that we're in now, even with the weird election and everything else, we're looking at highly unusual activity, centralizing of force, and then a kind of insanity on top of it. And so, we ask ourselves, where does this power base come from? And we come up against dynamic cases that expose the deep state, like the Vicki Morgan story. And when we look at it deeply, we get a hint of it. What's involved? Well, they're operating out of Hollywood in this period. We have all this sex blackmail involved. We have a sexpionage piece, an entire apparatus for getting blackmail on these figures, but also intelligence. And that brings us right into the Khashoggi piece. And I'll tell you, there's a lot that suggests in the case of Morgan, there's a lot of Saudi involvement with Morgan. I haven't even gone into that piece. So that's kind of a long way around answering it. What else you got?
Sarah Jane says, Bryce Taylor was programmed by Kissinger to be a sex slave / spy. Thanks for the Memories is the name of her book, and Bob Hope was also her handler.
Well, listen, Hope was deep, I've never been able to absorb her information the way I could Kathy O'Brien's. So I think Kathy O'Brien's information felt a little more vital to me. Whatever it was with Taylor's information, it's interesting. So, if somebody finds something in it, that's good. I've never been able to myself. Something about Kathy O'Brien's work on that front I always got it a lot better. But
can we go into Kathy O'Brien a little bit?
Well, in many ways, they did the same thing with her and Ford is involved in her story, of course. But they did the same thing with her that they did with Vicki, which is they used her as a messenger. They had her in a MKULTRA sex slave program, which she had been in since a child. And, just to abbreviate this, the piece that I find interesting is they have at a certain level something, we talk about steganography a lot in this program, especially the X steganography, but they have a way that they need to communicate. So they'll say, I can't email it. I can't put it in secret cipher. I need to find a way to communicate something to this other leader, and it has to be just between us. So what they have, especially with people who have this condition DID, they have the ability to program them with messages and even having them speak in languages and with accents. So there's a whole program for that. And then they use them as messengers. They'll send them out, like they have Vicki going to Morocco and Saudi Arabia. Okay. If she's going out there and doing that, it's probably for this sexpionage stuff. However, in Kathy O'Brien's case, and she was used by various politicians sexually, absolutely, but they also used her as a messenger. So she could go to a foreign leader and say, using that DID side of her brain, here's the message, and she just memorizes it. So she's like a human tape recorder. So there's a lot as we get into this. Wow. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We have going deep here in X series 104. It is the deep state assassination of female target, Vicki Morgan. We're going to be taking your questions here in just a minute now.
I got to throw this out here.
Yeah.
So PV said there was a Showbiz Pizza in Kathy O'Brien's hometown of Muskegon, I guess.
I didn't know that. Wow. Well, she's from Michigan.
Oh, Michigan.
Yeah. And Ford is in her story. What happens actually is that her dad is sending pornography through the mail. It's underage. And the mail inspector catches it, and then they come back to her dad and they say, basically, you have a choice. Either we'll send you to prison or you can do all these kind of deep state activities for us. And he chooses the latter. So there's a very, very, it's an incredible thing that her story opened up. And what people don't talk about a lot is there's a lot of UFO stuff in her book, because she doesn't know what to make of it exactly. But whenever she's around these politicians, or whenever she's assigned to one or becomes one of their slaves or whatever, they talk about how, hey, we know about this UFO stuff. And did you know, and they do things, they demonstrate their ability to transform their appearance and things like that. So yes, it's quite remarkable. And you can take it just on you can just take the kind of deep state side of it. But if you go a little deeper with Kathy O'Brien stuff, you're going to find UFOs in there. You're going to have shapeshift. There's a lot of deep stuff going on in her work. Remarkable. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to just touch on Cornfeld, because I wanted to wrap that piece up with him, and then we're going to take into your questions.
Okay.
We know Cornfeld is a big piece.
It feels that way, doesn't it?
It really, I'll tell you, the more I get into him, we're going to do an episode just on him, I promise. This was the New York Times, July 12th, 1983. Sex tapes are said to show US AIDS. This is a story they couldn't keep down. It was funny, when I was digging around in this, I found out that I was looking for articles about Vicki in the Village Voice, because they were incredibly politically active in the 80s. And what I found was there was a big AIDS scandal about money, $394 million missing. And I'll tell you, in that article, they were saying, who's really misusing these funds? Yeah, that's a very young Anthony Fauci right there. Fire Fauci, we know him well. Fauci, who they've used as the titular head of the rollout of the emergency, and who's changed his story so many times now, he doesn't know what he looks like. He's operating back there in 1986 and stuff. There's missing money back then. So how deep is this guy in the program? I wanted to mention this too, and Olivia, I told you that the JFK Oliver Stone is coming out with a 2-hour documentary, but there's also another 2 bonus hours, so potentially a 4-hour documentary follow-up 30 years later to his blockbuster, the JFK movie. That was just premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, and supposedly the information that he dug into there, completely off the charts. I can't wait till that comes out. And I have to do this as well before we go into questions. People magazine. Okay, there's a big People magazine. they did the 100 Reasons to Love America, and like one of the main reasons was, hey, COVID scientists, and so, and like your happy vaccine, which loves you unless it gives you blood clot. But they had The Rock, Dolly Parton in there, but right up next to The Rock and Dolly Parton, they had Lou. Yes, Lou Elizondo. It's fresh from the TTSA and the CIA to give you UFO disclosure through his new company, Skyford. Who controls the media? The Central Intelligence Agency. Who is promoting a UFO threat scenario for the CIA? Lou Elizondo. Who is promoting Lou Elizondo? People magazine. It's funny. We talk about people getting thrown off social media and all the things we've experienced and all the rest. Why is People magazine promoting this guy? I mean, gee, I guess that CIA contract helps when it comes to getting broad media for these things. No doubt about it. I guess Lou's not worried about losing his channel. That's a pretty good CIA hookup. Mm-hmm. Not bad. And the same picture from 2017. Go ahead. What do you got?
Well, I was just reading that. It sounds like there's a connection. Here we go. Count, a.k.a. Eric Hyben. It was either bought out or changed the name from Showbiz to Chuck E. Cheese, if I remember correctly. So
Chuck E. Cheese is what it became. Showbiz Pizza.
Wow.
Chuck E. Cheese.
So that is actually really targeting children and birthday parties and
true.
All of that. Mm-hmm.
True. I mean, I'm not saying anything about Chuck E. Cheese. We just don't know. But we know that the foundation of this thing had to do with a major, player. And his complex of wanting to be called a king and, doing this kind of dress up thing. And it was fascinating. There was a African-American call girl. This was completely unrelated to anything. And she was coming out with her own bio and she was telling her stories. She's in her late 60s now. And she'd gone all through this stuff in the 70s and 80s. And she was like, yeah, I was a high price call girl. And but she said, I knew this Vicki Morgan and she used to take my fur coats because all of her clients were really like high rollers, And she said, but I'll tell you, it's an interesting thing. When I went in, I got paid to go up to see this guy in a hotel, and it was Bloomingdale. And when I got there, there were all these women dressed as maids, and I was supposed to dress up as a maid. And then his thing was to beat them while calling them racist names and stuff. And she said as soon as he got like his whip or whatever out, that she ran out of there. And she was like, I had been paid already, so it didn't matter to me. Like, and I never went back and dealt with that. But she said, I remember him. So this whole thing about Bloomingdale, there's a lot of carnage out there from him all the way back to this actress that exposed him. And that was from an incident in the 1940s. This guy died in 1983. So it's just, an unbelievable trail of carnage for him. So I'm going to read the Cornfeld thing, and then we'll do questions. How does that sound?
Sure, sounds great.
All right. So it's the war of the big hair there, by the way. Who wore that hair better? Is it Betsy Bloomingdale or Nancy Reagan? I think Betsy has the edge there.
I think she does too.
That is some, yeah.
That's serious hairspray.
The hair is
I'm
not
impressed.
This is the woman, by the way, the actress. Janice Page was her name, and she's the one who exposed, at the age of 95, came out with this story about Bloomingdale. Keep doing that. Bloomfield's on my mind because of my research. In yesterday's Hollywood Reporter, actress, singer Janice Page, 95, posted a first-hand saga of a traumatic attempted rape. It happened in 1944 when Page was 22. Her assailant was Alfred Bloomingdale, the compulsive, sexually driven heir to the Bloomingdale fortune, who was 28 at the time. The incident was ugly and brutal, but at least Page managed to escape. So, ripples from this guy's actions are still coming out. The guy who escaped a lot of notice in all this was Cornfeld. I'm going to read this, but just to back up again everything I was saying earlier, this is the LA Times. Attorney in Vicki Morgan case pleads no contest. And this is how I'm going to wrap up the Robert Steinberg piece of this. Remember, he's the one who got the tapes. He's the one who represented her, and he is the one who tried to represent Pancoast, who he thought was being taken for a ride. This is the LA Times from May 18, 1985. Beverly Hills attorney Robert K. Steinberg pleaded no contest Friday to a criminal contempt charge stemming from his refusal to answer questions dealing with the purported Vicki Morgan sex tapes during a 1983 court appearance. He had learned, I'm going to shut up about this and not say anything, and they charged him with contempt of court, and here they are in 1985 trying to prosecute. Steinberg, who attracted national attention when he announced that summer that he had obtained videotapes showing sadomasochistic sex parties involving Morgan, her longtime lover, the late Alfred Bloomingdale, and Reagan administration officials, never produced the tapes. Bloomingdale, co-founder of Diners Club, was a close friend of President Reagan, and more. Beverly Hills municipal judge Weiss imposed a 6-month suspended sentence on Steinberg and fined him $1,190 on the misdemeanor charge. The negotiated plea, lawyers said, should serve as the official conclusion to the bizarre episode, which began several days after Morgan, a model, was bludgeoned to death July 7th, 1983, by a friend, Marvin Pancoast, at her rented condominium in North Hollywood. Pancoast was later convicted of first-degree murder. Steinberg, who briefly represented Pancoast, told police that on July 9th he acquired 3 videotapes showing sex parties from a woman who had refused to identify herself. The attorney said he planned to destroy the tapes, which he claimed included footage of U.S. congressmen and 4 high-ranking Reagan administration officials and friends, none of whom he identified, unless White House officials wanted to see them. But 3 days later, hours after the district attorney's office asked that the tapes be preserved as potential evidence in the Pancoast case, Steinberg reported them stolen. This is the official story of what happened to the tapes. Steinberg was initially charged with filing a false police report. Deputy Assistant Lawrence Lago said in an interview that the false report charge is difficult to prove because 2 key witnesses who worked for Steinberg's telephone answering service, both of whom had testified before the grand jury that indicted Steinberg, are no longer available to appear at trial. One witness is dead, he said, and the other has disappeared. So let me interpret that for you. His only 2 witnesses that he had these tapes who could, corroborate. One of them was dead and the other one had disappeared. I was trying to find information on Steinberg after the fact, and it's very difficult. He went so underground that it's remarkable. But I'll tell you, considering that he had tapes that could take down the Reagan administration, which was very powerfully in the hands of Vice President Bush, and an entire CIA apparatus was committed to the Nicaraguan Contra wars and all the rest of it, there was no way that this information could come out and take down the Reagan administration. So they had to do by any means necessary. And one of the very important key targets of all that, even though she had been in there with Bloomingdale and one of his ultimate favorites, and that he'd used her for all these different things, by the time she had turned 30 and her protector had died, Bloomingdale, there was no way out for Vicki Morgan. And with that, Miss Olivia, I am going to turn to you.
There is a wealth of information in
Yes.
the ideas room. I can't wait to read through it. Okay. I want to start with this one. Fuber Fighter says, we have spent a lot of time on the late 20th century in these various and nefarious deeds, but I think it probably all traces back to ancient times. And don't be surprised if Sodom and Gomorrah. Would you like to discuss that a little bit?
Sodom and Gomorrah is fascinating, and that is kind of the blueprint, the story there. The most fascinating thing about Sodom and Gomorrah, it looks like it went down in a nuclear job, but it's listed there in the Bible as, God destroys the place. It is interesting, though, because these angels come down and they try to kind of reason with Lot and check in with him and say, like, can you find so many good men will save the city? And when they come, the kind of corrupted crowds try to, spend time with them, and they look at them and they're like strangely illuminated. So they, they're moving in on these angels. And so the angels warn them, basically stay back, and the angels blind them. So whoever was operating back there, dealing with the people of Sodom, had some serious, serious abilities, highly, dangerous. But the story is remarkable, and I think that a lot of these things do have ancient roots, no question about it. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to just leap into the JFK assassination for a second.
Yes.
Captain Maddock wants to know, what is the best, most accurate documentary on the JFK assassination on YouTube, please?
Well, I don't know if it's on YouTube anymore, actually, but The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Guilty Men, is the best. Now, he'd been doing The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Nigel Turner, who was this unbelievable director from the UK. He went in and got the real facts. But he'd started in 1988 with the Men Who Killed Kennedy series, came back in the mid-90s and did it. But when he came back in 2003 with The Guilty Men, and there was a big LBJ piece in there, everyone from LBJ's widow to Clinton sued the History Channel, and they got that documentary blocked. Sometimes you can see it. I got the actual disc for it. I have 2 copies of it, so it'll never disappear. But it is remarkable across the board. And I believe that the information about the embalmer and the information about LBJ and the information that they had in there from LBJ's lawyer, Bar McClellan, who I've spoken to, and who maybe someday I'll have him on the program, because he was LBJ's lawyer, and he said it was known in the firm that LBJ was connected with the case. But I think that really struck at the heart of it. Why would you have Bill Clinton joining the lawsuit? Think about that. That is remarkable. But yes, no question about it.
A cult fan. There's a recent Nicolas Cage movie called Willy's Wonderland, which takes a mock Chuck E. Cheese place and talks about how it was a satanic child sacrifice place with a curse on it.
Whoa.
I know. Najat Madri says, a few years back, there was a satanic ritual setup that was discovered in the basement of a Chuck E. Cheese in Chicago. There's a lot here.
Listen, I'm telling you, the Pizzagate thing touched on something, because those notes are undeniable that some kind of messaging system was taking place. And we all know, Podesta is a very dicey character, which is why Podesta and his DeLong, Elizondo, all those connections, those things bother me that they're around the UFO file, because it tells me that that's where they're going. This is what they want to use. And they're some of the worst people I think we have on the scene. Yes.
Najat again. Could the use of child sex slaves be more than just perversion, maybe some kind of occult practice?
Yes. There's a whole range of things there, I think. But, I think the way a lot of these people think is they think of people as resources. And but there's also, on the more occult side of it, I think there is the snatching of the innocence thing. So we get into a whole discussion that lends itself to kind of a spiritual warfare discussion. But I think that so much of the border push to have people through the border is also because of this human trafficking aspect. Also, what we hear, if we get into this deeply enough, we hear that the underground bases need steady stock of employees. And it's pretty easy to have people just disappear when they are in those big migrant groups, So those are the types of things that I think come to mind for sure. Yes.
This is interesting. A cult fan again. Having UFOs as a scapegoat for MKUltra cover for child rape, i.e., it was aliens who raped you, makes too much sense.
Well, that's interesting. See, I think, look, I believe, I'm going to say this because I spend so much time debunking the false UFO thread and push and stuff, is that I'm a great, deep believer in the UFO reality and a deep believer in the fact that, you know, gray aliens have abducted people and the Betty and Barney Hill story. I've seen those stories for years. I've talked to people who have been abducted, and I believe it completely. Now, I think along with that, the MyLabs and the imitative things, you know, people, for example, Stephen Greer put out a documentary where he did a very good job sizing up the Elizondo, Chris Mellon op as the phony UFO threat op. And then, but when he started to talk about abductions, he said that there were only military abductions and that aliens hadn't done that. So that's where things go awry. However, pointing out the idea that the military does it is important. So, you know, it's interesting how you need to kind of navigate this territory of things that people say and the things that we hear in this field, because you get a lot about a UFO threat, which is the CIA trying to drum up a thing to be able, along with the huge apparatus, not just the CIA, but certainly the CIA's got the lead on it, because the CIA has, along with the aerospace companies, the lead on the UFO file. Okay, so when you're dealing with misinformation around the UFO file, you're dealing with the Central Intelligence Agencies, no question about it. And they've, look at Gordon Novell, for example, who features very heavily in the case that we just went into. He's very deep. You know, there's actually an interview with him talking about UFO energy with Kerry Cassidy. You know, he had reinvented himself as like a UFO guy before he died. But he'd been around that UFO thing since the late 60s. So we have disinformation agents solid around it. And, you know, Elizondo in People magazine is the biggest disinformation artist that we have out there right now pushing the UFO file. Complete CIA, DIA trained counterintelligence agent. Those aren't the people you go to for truth. That's like going to the KKK for a togetherness rally with, you know, the NAACP. It doesn't make any sense. So, you know, you don't go to those types of people for that. But it is interesting, and I take the point that the, you know, there's a process that takes place in the alien abduction scenario, which lends itself very much to sounding like a kind of rape scenario. So, you know, these things have to be kind of psychically parsed out to see what it is we're talking about. But it's a great point.
The timing with what is coming out now about abuse, you have to wonder whether they're going to use some kind of alien excuse, right? Are they going to scapegoat? That's what a cult fan is getting into as cover for their misdeeds.
Yeah,
it's worth considering.
Well, here's the thing. You know, you had the Franklin scandals, which are clear human trafficking cases, trafficking of children. Then you have all of these different things. You know, I went back earlier and talked about the NSA spying and warrantless wiretaps and all this stuff that happened in the wake of 9/11 and the emergency that we're still living under in relation to that. Now we can look back at it and see the operation of how they did this and how they have us, you know, most of 9/11 was to have us living in this perpetual state of emergency so they can do anything they want with that state of emergency. But the thing that's going on now, it is even harder to see, because even looking back on 9/11, there's a curve there. It takes a while to really get to see what's going on. And it's through Professor Scott's work, I think, that we get the real vision of what was up with 9/11. And, you know, people who brought it up and try to expose it, we're coming up to the 20th anniversary. And, you know, I was talking with Catherine about doing a 20th anniversary show with her. I'd like to do one with Professor Scott as well. look, 9/11 is another one of these deep events, which we find ourselves, you know, we understand it, but we can see 20 years looking back now, everything that they got accomplished as a result of it. That's how we need to look at these deep events. There's no question about it. Yes.
I didn't know about this. Stephanie Ramirez says, has DJ seen Del Bigtree talking about an alien/immortal cell line being used in some of the gene therapy?
I didn't hear him. I've heard of that. I have not heard Bigtree talk about it. I didn't know Bigtree even mentioned aliens at all. Listen, he's the big health guy who tries to give you information about the injection. So no, I would like to see more of that. Somebody brought up Jose Chung.
Yeah.
What was that? Nice. That's a fantastic X-Files.
That's probably
episode.
the best. So PV again says there's tons of documented UFO sightings in Kathy's hometown also. Look up the 1994 ? Incident. So.
Listen, when I talked to Kathy O'Brien, and we had some very, very good conversations that are available. If you look up on this channel under Deep State, you'll see there's 2 interviews with Kathy O'Brien. And
God, that was a long time ago.
She didn't want to push the UFO side of it. And she said, I don't know what they were up to presenting that side, but they certainly did. And if you go into the books, it's so thick, actually, through her dealings with people like Bennett and stuff. It's interesting. It's very interesting to me. That's how I think they would use it. You know, certainly their advantage is that they know things that we don't know about it. Look, here's the thing on the alien range, okay? Here's the range of things. We have Phil Schneider. He told us about, I was building these underground bunkers and for the government, which it's clear that he was. And at a certain point, they ran across gray aliens who were working for our military, but they were so shocked that they went to shoot at them. And, it was basically a firefight between him and some aliens there in New Mexico, in Dulce. That's where so much of that Dulce story comes from. So there are stories on that range. There's stories of kind of angelic Adamski style aliens in here to instruct us, the kind of Pleiadian style. So really, there's obviously a whole field of experience when you get in there. This is why I'm always recommending Gigi Young's work, because I think she did a fantastic presentation. I'm trying to think. I think it was the episode just before the one that she just did, where she has a whole section on the Greys. And maybe what I would love Gigi to do is put out that section of the Greys as like a solo video. And maybe she already did it, but I watched it and it is outstanding. So Gigi, if you're out there, and this is it, which is she equates the Greys with a scientific race that has cloned themselves out and needs to come back in order to splice the genes in order to have life again. So they made the kind of wrong choice. Now, I think she was saying that they represent Earth's future on the transhumanist side. And, you can look at them from different ways. I remember, and I've spoken about my conversations with this person who had made this prediction around the very interesting sightings over New York City on October 13, 2010, and Stan Fulham. But later, he died shortly after I contacted him about it. And then I found out that the prediction had come from this group called the Transcenders. Rick Thurston was the person who was channeling it, a la Edgar Casey. And I had something like 12 or 13 hours worth of tapes talking with those Transcenders. And they have a very similar point of view about the Greys, that they had basically cloned themselves into a kind of perfection and lost the original source material. So Gigi's version, the Transcenders version, had a kind of merge there, and the Transcender stuff was never public. They have public things, but that particular interpretation wasn't. So this is the interesting thing again with Gigi's work. I think it's very cutting edge. That alien piece needs to be understood. I do want to get into this because they have so many people online trying to talk about how much G-force is involved when a flying saucer moves. those things, I mean, yes, they perform maneuvers that, you know, they have an apotheum effect on the physics of reality that we deal with. And so they alter the physical reality, just like the X technology does, right? So when we get into this a little bit, you know, it gets pretty deep, because I think we're getting caught up on the wrong aspects of the UFO thing when looking at it. I think a lot of the field has collapsed under the weight of the CIA manipulation, frankly, you know, and I think that they've gotten them into talking about, oh, it's a threat, or let's talk about how it flies and does these maneuvers that we can't do. Well, we haven't looked at the technology in the public that these people have, so you don't know what they can do. And then you have the things that we can produce that are hidden from the public, the things that are produced from some interdimensional nature source, right? Dimensional doorway. And then you have visiting craft from other systems, off-world civilizations. So those are very different things. And like what they call the Tic Tac and things like that, so much of that is Lockheed Martin technology that's been hidden, the same things that Eisenhower and JFK warned about when we were going into space and going to this jump of technology. They said, don't let this group over here, military industrial complex and the CIA, get their hands on it, because they're the ones who will run it over a cliff. They had their own real battles with them. This is the history that we come from. So, and what have we seen? The CIA and the military industrial complex has pretty much rolled the roost. Look, they talk about differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Every year they sign off on a $750 to $800 billion military budget. Okay, there are no active wars. Okay, so what are you spending that money on? That's what we know about on record. Remember, they have missing money as well. So what are we actually talking about here? What are you spending $800 billion on? It's not on military pay. You know, where's all the money going? So there's never any question on that. You know, so let's say you have the most left-wing person, AOC. Does she ever come out and say, we have to cut that military spending? No, she doesn't say anything about it. The Republicans never do, of course. They all get together every year and cheer on and sign off on that military budget, which is bloated beyond belief. The thing is, the military is very important, you know, but we don't need $800 billion on the record for it every year. It's ridiculous. It's the biggest hog of the entire federal budget. That's absurd, you know, and that is the takeover of the military industrial intelligence complex. This is what we're living under. And now all of those forces inside that have been protected, now they have the pharmaceutical companies, and there's a corporate aerospace sink there, you know. So we're getting into territory where it almost doesn't make sense to step around the problem anymore. It just becomes obvious. And things like, you know, facades like Democrat and Republican just don't hold up, because nobody talks about the military budget anymore. So it's ridiculous. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, we're getting deep into it now. Fantastic questions tonight in the Ideas Room. Really like it. This is X Series episode 104. We've been diving deep on the assassination of Vicki Morgan, who I want to say was dropped into the middle of a web of things that are normally invisible to us here in the public. But we get a snapshot of it through the death of a figure like Vicki Morgan, because she was associated with this high financial aspect, this high political power, this sexpionage, and this global trafficking of women for purposes of blackmail and intelligence gathering that we don't frankly understand. And the popular media of the day and now they just try to scrub it. We're into like real Orwellian media now. But the popular media of the day was, oh, well, you know, she lived fast, died young, she was on the fast lane, what can you do? It's a much deeper story, and it serves us well to remember her as a person walking in to the likes of this deep state machine of Bloomingdale and all the twists and perversions and the kind of illness that she plugged herself into. And then, of course, her highly suspicious death. These things, I think, call to us on a subconscious level to look a little bit deeper. Yes.
Cosmic Ocean, is there any information about Vicki Morgan's family? Is she part of a deep state family? She seems so comfortable mingling with power brokers. If she had a child at 15, do we know who the father was? What's the story with her obviously being sexually abused as a child? Her home city is an Air Force town.
Yes, that's true. And her dad was a military guy, but he died like basically right when she was born. Mm-hmm. And then the stepfather, he was there till she was 9, I think, and then he left. You know what's interesting about that question? There is a lot, I think, when we think about her family. A couple of quick notes on this. She was born in Colorado Springs. Her mother, Constance Laney, and her father was an Air Force veteran. They divorced soon after Vicki's birth. Constance remarried, that's it. But then that husband died when Vicki was about 9. So the Air Force husband and her divorce almost immediately after she's born, and the mother divorce right after she's born. And then she remarries, and the guy that she remarries to dies when Vicki is 9. So it's already traumatic.
Is she an only child?
As far as I know, she actually is an only child. Let's see if there's anything else to contradict that. So she relocated with her mom to Montclair, California. And at 16, she became pregnant, dropped out of Chaffee High School. She had a son, Todd, who we mentioned, who is described going to the funeral service as a punk, kind of like a 14-year-old punk rocker. You know, he has a mohawk and stuff. And I don't think he's ever done anything publicly. Todd, if you're out there, we'd love to talk to you. And she ran away from home in 1968 at the age of 16. And she left Todd with her mom. And then she was an usher at Grauman's Chinese Theater. But she had a marriage before this whole Bloomingdale thing, and it was to an older guy. He was in his late 40s, and his name was Lamb, Earl Lamb.
As in L-A-M?
L-A-M-B. Yes, like Lamb. So, yeah, you know, if they mention Bernie Cornfeld here, and I promised to say some things about Cornfeld, and I didn't really, so I'm just going to pop this in here real quick. I mentioned the thing about his mutual fund company. He created these kind of false mutual funds. American servicemen bought into them. He grew up in Brooklyn, okay, but he went to the Netherlands to launch this. Investors Overseas Services was the name of it, and he became a billionaire as a result. He was actually born in Istanbul, and his dad was Romanian Jewish, and they came to Brooklyn. So he just had a natural gift for selling, they say. But then he got into this mutual funds thing, and he decided that he would go over to Europe and launch this. There's not a lot in his official biography of how this happened, because where do you get the connections and the money to launch a mutual fund company? But I can tell you that in the 1960s, as I said, people like Governor Brown were his CFO. So incredible political reach for this company. It was in Geneva, Switzerland, and it was incorporated in Panama. How advanced was this money laundering outfit? He established mutual funds in various jurisdictions. Okay. There's a weird twist here. I seem to remember all along the way, like weird fashion designers come in and out of his life. But so he was sentenced to 11 months in preventive prison after they figured out his mutual fund company was a scam. And this other company came in and bought it out to continue the scam, but under less dicey auspices. And he was able to have this kind of luxurious life. And he went straight to Beverly Hills. Following his acquittal, he settled in Beverly Hills, where he ingratiated himself to film industry circles. And he lived in the Gray Hall mansion, built in 1909 and at one time leased by Douglas Fairbanks. He plugged himself into this Hollywood royalty piece. And this is what I've noticed about him. Very, very unusual character. He listed among his close friends Elizabeth Taylor, Michelle Phillips, Warren Beatty, really close with Warren Beatty, Lawrence Harvey, Victor Lones, Richard Harris, Tony Curtis, so on the list goes. That mansion was used, Gray Hall, in A Star is Born, which was a huge movie in the mid-'70s with Chris Christopherson and Barbra Streisand. At the age of 60, Cornfeld had an affair with then 19-year-old Heidi Fleiss. And you see how these things work. So he had created his own network, like Bloomingdale had a network, and then when he gets older, Heidi Fleiss, you know. So these pieces are there, and they need to be kind of examined a little bit deeper than just in that kind of like high society pimps and that kind of thing. Or even the way that we understand the Epstein-Maxwell piece, you know. And I think we got a real public lesson. Like the alternative community understood the Maxwell-Epstein piece really well in a lot of ways and did a lot of good investigation on it that the mainstream couldn't touch. But I think there is a deeper aspect, and it has to do with the ocean aspect and the hot zone aspect related to the Epstein story. So that is absolutely crucial. Yes.
I really love this. State Wench 2. Bob Crane of Hogan's Heroes fame was murdered in '78 by a blunt instrument. He was involved in videotaping sex tapes. Could he be the person filming in LA?
Could he be the person making the films?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's really true. He was in Hogan's Heroes, and it's always been a strange thing about his death. But we know that he had this incredible, like, that he was shooting all of this pornography. And they think that the death was related to that. That is a really good thing. I didn't run across him in the Vicki Morgan aspects, but I think that we see that there was an underground operating there on the pornography side in the 70s that was used heavily for blackmail. And it's little understood, you know, when I spoke to Robert Merritt, although we spoke about the Nixon time capsule and all these things, you know, his principal job was as, he was like Vicki Morgan. He was a good-looking young male prostitute, and he said that over 100 senators, congressmen, and judges had been set up by him. And basically what the CIA would do would be to have him develop a casual acquaintance with these people, and then these people would offer to, you know, take care of him, be a sugar daddy, basically. And then he would take them to his pad there, and the CIA had set up all these cameras, and they had all the blackmail that they needed. But that part of his story, I think, is so riveting. And, you know, Merritt gave us a real snapshot on how the blackmail aspect operates. That is Cornfeld. Again, for those who missed him the first time, there he is surrounded by his doting fans. Yes, what do you got?
I just want to throw this out there. Frank Monday said the first 2 cuts on a pizza form an X.
Oh, that's good stuff. Yes.
Okay, Confectionery Arts says the Bonanno crime family used 600 pizzerias on the eastern seaboard for heroin trafficking. Pizza connection case prosecuted by Rudy Giuliani.
That's really true. And look, when we got into, he has me thinking with the pizza cut, and we cut into this now. The mafia side is big, and I'll kind of close this mafia piece with Abramoff. I mentioned Abramoff because his dad was partners. Frank Abramoff was partners in the Diners Club with Alfred Bloomingdale. But Jack Abramoff became really much more notorious. And now the Lyndon LaRouche people did a really big deep dive on Abramoff. And I have to say, they got some things in there, but something that really caught my eye was they continued to drill down on the mob family's connections with Abramoff. And I think this brings us back to Frank Abramoff and his mob connections. But let's do this real quick. Abramoff, you remember him? They made the lobbying rules based on him. And by the way, he got out of jail after serving, I think, about 3 years in prison. And when he got out, he got involved in this crypto scheme, and he started to lobby, and they used the same laws that had been created because of his activities to prosecute him again. So he's up now for going back to prison. But what is this piece about the mafia here with Abramoff? Jack Abramoff was born in Atlantic City, the son of Frank and Jane Abramoff. The family moved to California in '68, and Jack grew up in Beverly Hills. Again, his father continued to do business in Atlantic City, bringing his increasingly powerful connections into a family partnership with his brother Bernard Abramoff, and later bringing in his son Jack. After gambling casinos were legalized in Atlantic cities in the 70s, the Abramoffs focused on real estate investments pegged to prospects of growth of casinos. Sound like somebody we know? It sounds like Trump, literally. And so they mentioned, there's a whole Bonanno piece in there on that, but here's what I found interesting. Mob lawyer Roy Cohn, who we know, Cohn goes back to the McCarthy hearings. It's a real deep state creature, but he was President Trump's mentor politically. Jack Abramoff's confessed dirty money dealings of the past few years took decades of practice to refine, beginning with the financing of his college Republican organization. On July 8th, 1981, Abramoff wrote to Roy Cohn, the legal counsel to the leading mafia families in New York and Canada, asking for funding and discussing with the mob's man the use of secret fundraising lists of the Republican Party. Jack Abramoff wrote, quote, "Alfred Bloomingdale, a close personal friend of my family, told me to contact you immediately. Although we college Republicans are an arm of the RNC, we must become financially self-sufficient. Because of his close association with the president, Mr. Bloomingdale was able to free up the RNC contributor list for our use." That's extraordinary. "Within the next couple of weeks, we must raise $50,000 in order to mail and phone bank these lists. I have no doubt we will pyramid that $50,000 to over $1 million within the first year." Wow. Cohn's response may be known only to Abramoff. This piece, I think, when you mention the mafia there, it's crucial for us to understand the mafia piece in this. And it goes deep into our own politics. And of course, it goes right into the Trump aspect and the wars there, because you do have a faction of that deep state, the America First faction that had they have a kind of a patriotism piece in that mafia side. And there's no question that the people that Trump had to operate with in the gambling and real estate, those are mob people. There's no question about it. And then you have the other like weird freak mob stuff on the West Coast promoting the Pelosi, which is a complete mob family. So we have to have a greater understanding when we say deep state, what we're talking about sometimes. And the mob is a big piece. Yes. So we'll take just two more questions.
Ooh, just two more. Well, I just want to throw this out. Mermaid in the USA says there's an article that claims that Bloomingdale thought he was the Marquis de Sade.
Yes.
Reincarnated?
Yes. He did. And, Vicki, one of the things in her court statements was that she said her therapy was basically getting him to try to get help for that because she thought he was such a Jekyll and Hyde. And, it's interesting. This guy, I didn't really get into the atrocities part with him, but I think we get a clear enough picture that he kept his own sex slaves, that he was constantly in this position of role playing where he was an emperor or he was a plantation owner or whatever. And it was always his job to do, you know, tying up and whipping and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So this is where, you know, this was the twist in Alfred Bloomingdale. But you have to remember this. He had those tendencies, plus he was sitting at the top of the foreign policy, you know, choosing the foreign policy team for the Reagan administration. And he was that close with Reagan. So, you know, it really shows, I think, we're getting a snapshot there of the elements that are in power, you know. So people might have voted for Reagan for very different reasons, but standing right there with them was this Bloomingdale piece. Yes.
Deborah Blair. The William Morris Agency was deep CIA and mafia. They were behind the pedophilia, sex, and drugs in Hollywood, music from the 60s on, and ties with Scientology. It was the talent agency of all agencies internationally in the 60s, 70s, and 80s until one of the agents split off and made CAA talent agency. CAA. But most of the agents in both were CIA.
Absolutely, and Tom Cruise would come out of that. So the Scientology piece, whew, that is absolutely fascinating. The William Morris thing, I've discovered some things that I will put on the record about William Morris, and I absolutely agree. They were an incredibly powerful force, and the interface between the Hollywood corruption and the political corruption. And, you know, there was Pancoast right in the middle of it all, with all the databases for everything. And what was he doing? He was setting up this person. He was basically trying to be a pimp in the middle of all that. A very, like a high courier pimp, which is why he probably got along so well with Vicki, because that was her world. She was an expert. He was, in a way, just on his way up.
I just had an epiphany, really, that there are three real ways to make money. And, you know, when people really break it down and they figure it out.
Slavery, we know.
No, well, I'm going to say you're a pimp. There's different forms of slavery. You're a pimp, you're a drug dealer, or you're a thief. And, you know, I think in the government, you know, they're thieves. You know, they've figured that out, exactly how to do it, sort of, quote, legally. And, you know, but then you get, you know, CIA, drug, this is what you do, right? If you want to be ultra rich, you want to get away with whatever you want to get away with, right? If you want to be depraved and get away with it, these are the things you need to do.
It's true. If you're sort of talking about the archetypes, the over view of what the archetype is in each.
Well, you know, they have that saying, like, the best way to get rich or something is like own a bank, right? You know what I mean? It's like, you know, it's just sometimes, you know, everybody else goes about it the hard way. Oh, you start a business and you know, you work hard, you're honest and everything. Nah, you're a pimp, you're a drug dealer, or you're a thief.
They don't reward you for being honest anymore. That's for damn sure. All right, everyone, fantastic questions tonight. Off the charts from the ideas room. We'll take one more question tonight, and then we will call it an evening. Yes.
Okay. Well, there were a lot of questions about Dorothy Kilgallen, and I know we've never actually done an episode on her, although we've discussed her in other episodes. Will there be a female targets episode on her specifically?
Oh yeah, absolutely. She's incredible. And what's remarkable is she did it all under the umbrella of her job, you know. This is somebody who came up doing columns and gossip and things like that, and it just ballooned out into knowing everyone's secrets. But she found herself in the middle of the Kennedy assassination, and that thing is, you know, it was like quicksand for these people, you know. And so you'd have people say, oh, I can really get to the bottom of this, and, you know, down they go. So, I think in relation to Kilgallen, she was onto the story. She had bribed a judge in order to be the only reporter to talk to Ruby one-on-one. She had had that 2-hour session with him. She had left there. She was heading for New Orleans. And a lot of people think she was looking to give that information to Jim Garrison. So instead, she wound up dead from an apparent drug overdose. And she was friends with Marilyn. She also was somebody who talked about the Roswell incident when it was a totally hidden thing. And she talked about, the fact that the Air Force was keeping alien bodies. And this is in the late 50s. She's talking about, so incredibly astute. And she was on What's My Line and all this stuff. So what happened was the results of her autopsy were preserved and some samples. And then somewhere down the line, we got the technology, the advancement in science, in order to check the story out about what she had taken and overdosed on, and it wasn't true. So Mark Shaw decided, based on the evidence he had uncovered, to go to the Manhattan DA and say, can you reopen this case? So the ball's been going back and forth ever since. But there's something I have to tell you, 58 years later, in relation to that Kennedy case, it's like there's so many layers to it. There's so many pieces outstanding from it that if you don't get some kind of a handle on it, ultimately, you won't understand the rest. So it was such a pivotal piece and a pivotal moment. And Kennedy's vision for the world, I was reading one of his quotes, which Pat Buchanan actually did a remarkable article on JFK. And what JFK says is, if we and the Russians can't agree on everything, at least we can make the world safe for diversity. Now think about that in relation to the current issues that we have with the tech oligarchs and with the political system. What they're saying is you have to think this way, and if you don't, you're so evil that we will alienate you in society and we will call you, non-vaccinated or whatever it is. Actually, no, the term is toxic free. You're toxin free if you haven't taken that. So, but you see the mentality, right? So just taking the vaccine as an example, unvaccinated, right? You are on something. And so they turn those people against them. Can you imagine?
Well, how about just pure? I'm pure human still. Thank you.
Yes. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Unaltered. Right?
Unaltered. So, we'll all get through. But the thing is, if we can't agree on everything, so if you have a huge populist wave and those people don't agree with the woke people who are largely being influenced by the CCP and phony groups like Antifa, then, we can make the world safe for diversity. Seems like very advanced. Can you imagine the Kennedy's logic being operative now, the conversation we need to have? It's absurd.
Well, it's so basic.
It is. We need that.
It's
exactly what we need. And see, we in the public didn't forget it, but the media systems, they've decided, as Catherine Austin Fitts has said, they need complete control now. And even in the things that we're talking about tonight with the female targets of the deep state, how does that whole apparatus come into being? What is it that they're trying to do? Inevitably, just like with the UFO file, it's hiding. They're trying to hide something. And they're trying to use it as an advantage over the public. Take the space program. We had Branson and Bezos out there like idiots, looking like absolute billionaire idiots doing what they're doing. And at the same time, they're trying to put the kibosh on Amazon starting its own union, those employees. And, that they had conditions like those employees had to urinate in bottles because they didn't have time to stop during the deliveries. This is the sickness of people like Bezos. And, Branson is a different take on it, but Bezos, I think, is a good snapshot of the illness that's been going on. And we've seen it, we've seen it with Apple factories. We've talked about it. And the Chinese way, which is, working those slaves to the bone. So the Chinese communist way. I should say Chinese Americans don't believe in that at all. But what's interesting to me about all this is, you know, as we come into this period, we're looking exactly like the two things are looking at each other. And when we see these weird things where these people on the ground saying, you know, lock down Australia because you have 4 cases. You can't leave your home. Don't talk to each other in the supermarket. And then these idiots, you know, I'm the richest man in the world and I'm going into space. And, you know, by the way, my employees can't form a union. And if they don't have time to stop for bathroom breaks, then that's just the way it goes. I mean, it's inhuman psychosis. I don't know what else you'd call it. We'll ask Deborah Blair to give us a name for it. But yes, I mean, so this gives us some sense of that. And I wanted to mention that in relation because, you know, people, it would be great to be excited about a space program, you know, and this is something that we've paid for years. But no, it's gone to the privatized side. And, you know, I mean, think about it. When Kennedy called for the space race, he didn't say, I'm going to the moon. You know, he said, we're going to work together to go to the moon and mankind will be better for it. These idiots are, I mean, I could go on all night, but yes, I think you get the idea.
Yeah, Russell Brand had a fantastic video on that.
He is funny. Yeah, he is really funny. All right, so we'll take one more question.
Okay. Now, I did not know about this. I guess this happened today. You have been busy preparing for the show, so I don't know if you know about this today, but a cult fan wanted me to ask you. Can you ask about the weird Joe Biden drinking children's blood comments?
It was
Do you know
weird.
about this?
Yeah, well, a reporter came up to him and said, you know, asked him a question, and it was pretty casual stuff. And they've been acting really weird, Biden team generally. But he said, do Republicans say that we drink the blood of children or something? And it was like, it was so out of context. The thing that he asked was totally different. It was like, I think it was about inflation or something. And then the reporter was like, I don't know, you know, like, what are you talking about? And Joe Biden runs away. You know, I mean, it doesn't act like a president. It's like I don't know. It's a pretty bad scene. If I saw him on the street, I would think he would need like a home health aide, you know?
Yeah.
I would.
Yeah,
I mean,
big time,
you would
totally.
think, do you need help getting to your car? You know, like it's a scary
You know,
thing.
that comment alone they may have to speed up Kamala's taken over, right? If he's that unpredictable right now.
Yeah, it's true. Although I think that she's already shown that she can't handle it. So they might need a third option here. Actually, I've heard people like Dick Morris and others who usually get a bead on things like this say that the Biden people are unhappy with her performance. So she might be on her way out. And it might be a long goodbye, but I don't know, you know, they remember this, like, they don't want to stumble too badly. They do want to psycho like Kamala in there calling the shots, you know, and they want to play the woman card with the race card to try to divide everybody up. But, and they want to be able to, you know, puff up about that. But right now, I think that they feel that she's driven down the opinion of Biden because she screwed up things like the border conversation. She got into fights with reporters, and she's generally been lackluster because she wasn't, you know, this is somebody who got 0.1% of the Democratic primary vote. The voters were never impressed with this person. And she has a very dicey, sketchy background. So that's the fact. Now, can you use somebody like that in politics? Damn sure you can use somebody like that in politics. But I think that all the advantages that she had going in with what the Democrats wanted are working against the Biden thing because she's too arrogant. And so publicly, she's doing that thing that Hillary did that drove her out of the race in 2016 is people didn't like her. So that's a fundamental too, you know. So I think it's a very confusing scene right now.
Oh, this is interesting. Tumultach O'Feargal says Biden will go, Harris will elevate. Pick Hillary for VP, and the Nixon-Ford scenario is set.
That's pretty good.
It is pretty good.
I think that Hillary has too much baggage for anybody to try to put her in anywhere. So I think we'll try the criminal mastermind stuff with the foundation and all that, but I don't think we'll see her in a political position again. Hopefully, God, please. I heard she was going to run for mayor of New York and shock everybody. Everyone, fantastic questions, fantastic ideas room tonight. We had a lot to get through. And, if I can leave you with one thought about the Vicki Morgan case, is that it gives us a real insight into what's actually taking place under the surface. And the more that we can understand how those different things interface, from politics to Hollywood to corruption to blackmail to sexpionage, then we're going to have a much better grasp on what they're trying to do with us now. And I have to tell you that for everyone out there watching and everyone in the ideas room tonight, we are in a perilous time with the antics of our leadership. And they change the antic on a daily basis. So we find ourselves in a very unusual situation, in fact. So we need each other's feedback and each other's support more than ever. I can tell you that. And I've been doing this for a fair amount of time. We're in a phase here where we need the voices, and we need to get behind the people like Gigi Young, and we need to get behind, Catherine Austin Fitz and Joseph Farrell and Alexandra Bruce at Forbidden Knowledge TV, in the things we're doing here. This is really the time for us to pool our knowledge and our resources and try to inform as many people as possible about the things that are going on. And really to take some of those heroes like RFK Jr. and try to spread the information that they've been giving us. Because there are a lot of incredible people stepping forward. Simone Gold, Dr. Simone Gold from America's Frontline Doctors. What was the name of that wonderful doctor the other day that you had recommended?
It's Peter
McCullough?
McCullough.
Yeah. This guy was a very straight, regular kind of doctor, and he had noticed a lot of imbalanced things in the reporting at the CDC. And so this is important, I think, for us to salute these people, support them, and to start to gather our own resources around this and really stand up to some of the incredible demagoguery, really, that's been going on. So I think we have a real chance to do that. And we can't do it with any better crew than the people in the ideas room. I'm going to do a few shout outs here.
I have a whole bunch of people to thank.
Yes.
Okay, I do want to say Dr. Peter McCullough, his interview is with Stu Peters, and if you go to forbiddenknowledgetv.net,
right,
Alexandra's site,
yeah,
she ran it. It's fantastic. It's the first thing I do every morning is I see what she posts and I watch it. So there you have it. Okay.
No question about it.
Thanking Occult Fan, Britannia Young, Stephen, Alex George, Carol Crumlish, Dorian Hewitt, Eurythmy is Fun, Jimmy Swags, Debbie McAdoo, William Quimby, Cosmic Ocean, Corey Branham, Steve Bosco, UFO Mark II, Shazam, Josh Randall, and Gummy Bears. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Fantastic. We really appreciate your support. It helps us do everything that we're doing here, and to all our subscribers, thank you, because you're what make us go, and we really appreciate it. We'll be delivering some incredible material for you guys coming up here in August, and as I mentioned, we have another interview with Catherine Austin Fitz. We're going to have Gigi Young back on the show shortly, and some real surprises there on the show front. Also some exciting events in the fall coming up for you. So we're really looking forward to it. I'll do a few shout outs here. Shazam, I saw that. The Morgan Report. Yes, it's great to have you here. Fantastic. Jennifer Michelle, Astro Sam, Occult Fan, of course. Man the Myth. Les Scott, Alyssa Austin, Olivia Wings Girl. Hey, look. Roosevelt, it's great to see you out there, Roosevelt. Fantastic. You've been sharing great stuff. Josh Randall, sir, it's great to see you. Golden Girl, Frank Monday, I hope it's a nice night over there. Brenda Fisher, Gil Bates. Did I mention that Abramoff worked for Bill Gates' dad? I'll have to get to that next time. Interview
In what
Jesse.
capacity?
He, he was a fundraiser.
Ah.
Fantastic. Wow. Great to have me and me alone. Scarlet Fire. It's great to see you out there. Of course, Kat Goida. Fantastic. Deborah Blair. Excellent to have you here. Chitty. Bethany Green. Excellent. Just a great crew out there tonight. I appreciate the comments and the emails and everything. You guys have been great with the links and really giving me a lot to work with and a lot to go on. So nice to have you here. We will be back on next Friday at 8 p.m. And Debbie McAdoo, great to see you out there. And have a fantastic weekend, everyone. And we'll be definitely giving you some surprises. Britannia Young, it's great to see you. Scratch. William Lester. James. Fantastic. Wow. So great to see so many of you. And we will be back with you next week. Have a fantastic weekend. And
did you thank Kat Goida?
I did.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kat.
There's an echo in here. Golden Girl, see? We'll be back with you. Esoteric Gold. Great name. Wow. Have a great night, everyone. And, it says end broadcast, but...
Never really ends.
It never really ends, let's face it. Great to have you here, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.